There is a particular hour in the Appalachian Mountains when the world goes quiet in a way the rest of the country has forgotten how to be quiet. It is not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a snowfall, or any of the silences city people comfort themselves with. It is the silence of a hollow that has been holding its breath for 100 years and has just decided to listen. If you have ever spent a night in those mountains, you know what I mean. You step off the porch and the dark does not arrive. It is already there, folded in among the rhododendron, draped over the ridgetops, crouched behind the woodpile. The air smells of wet pine and cold creek water and something older, something that has no name but that the old folks in these hollers learned, very young, not to name. The dogs know what it is. They hear it long before you do, and they go still at the foot of the stairs, and they do not bark. That is how you know you are somewhere particular. The stories in this book come from those hours. They come from porch lights and kitchen tables, from the back rooms of country churches where the revival has gone long past midnight, from preppers and preachers, from grandmothers who put their hands over your ears when you were 4 years old and told you, very softly, never to answer if you heard your name called out of the woods. They come from people who do not, as a rule, talk about such things outside the family. But here and there, in bars and bait shops and graveyards, in the patient way mountain people talk when they finally decide to talk, the stories come out, and they are older than the roads, and they are watching. I have arranged these tales as a single night's descent. You can read them straight through, in order, with the lights low. Each chapter carries a thread of the one before it. The motifs repeat on purpose. 3 knocks. A figure at the tree line, a voice in the woods that knows the names of the missing. By the time you reach the final chapter, the patterns will be familiar enough that you will startle at a sound coming from your own hallway, and you will not be entirely sure why. So pour yourself something warm, close the curtains the way your grandmother told you to, and settle in. The hollers are about to do what they have always done best. They are going to start talking, and they are not going to stop when you ask them to. The 3 knocks on Possum Trot Ridge there is a stretch of county road, not far from the Kentucky-Virginia line, that older people in the county still refuse to drive after dark. Not because the pavement is bad, not because the curves are sharp, although they are. It is because of the knocking. 3 knocks, slow, patient, always 3. Always spaced exactly as a human hand would space them against weathered pine, except that there is no hand, and there is no one knocking, and the door it is knocking on belongs to a cabin that has been empty since the winter of 1947. I first heard the story from a man named Calvin Pruitt, who ran a feed store outside Harlan, and who, in his later years, could not be persuaded by any amount of money or bourbon to set foot on the upper end of Possum Trot Ridge after sundown. He was not a frightened man. He had been a deer hunter all his life, a small-time ginseng buyer, a man who had buried 2 wives and 4 friends and had not, by his own admission, lost much sleep over any of it. But the knocking was something he would not negotiate with. It ain't a sound, he told me once, in the back of the store, while we waited out a thunderstorm. I want to make that clear. A sound is something your ears do. This is something your bones do. You hear it, sure, but you hear it the way you hear it when a horse runs up behind you in a pasture, not in your ears, back of your neck, in the soft part under your ribs. 3 of them, just like that. And then you wait for the door to open, because that is what knocks are for, and there is no one there. He told me the story in pieces, the way people in those mountains tell stories when they are telling you something they have carried in a chest for 60 years. The cabin, he said, had belonged to an old woman named Nettie Hensley, who had moved into it as a bride in 1909 and who had lived there alone for almost 40 years after her husband, a timber cruiser name of Albert, was killed by a falling yellow poplar up near the head of the hollow. She grew tobacco on the south slope. She kept bees. She went to the Free Will Baptist Church at the foot of the ridge on Sundays in a black dress with a hickory cane that her husband had carved her before he died. Nobody in the county had a cross word to say about Nettie Hensley. She was, by every account, a good woman. And then, one winter, she stopped coming to church. The first Sunday, nothing. The second Sunday, the deacon, a young man named Willard Mullins, walked the long gravel road up the ridge to check on her. He found the cabin smoking, the stove warm, a kettle on the boil, the table set with 2 plates. But Nettie was not in the house. Her coat was on its peg by the door. Her Bible lay open to the Book of Ruth on the kitchen table. There was a half-poured cup of coffee cooling on the counter, still showing steam. She had been there very recently, but she was not there now. Willard walked the ridge. He called her name. He stood out past the woodpile and shouted into the hollow. Nothing. He walked back down the ridge to the church. And he told the congregation that Nettie Hensley was missing, and by Sunday afternoon there were 14 men on the ridge searching. They found nothing. They found no tracks in the new snow except her own, leading from the cabin door to the spring house, where she kept her butter, and then back to the cabin door. The kettle still steamed. The coffee still cooled. The 2 plates sat untouched. They searched for 9 days. On the 10th day, Nettie's son, who had moved to Detroit 15 years earlier and who had not been back to the ridge since his father's funeral, arrived by bus. He was a quiet, city, softened man, balding, with a salesman's mustache and an honest expression of bewilderment. He did not know what the people of the ridge knew. He did not know the story of the upper end of Possum Trot. So he walked up the gravel alone, at dusk, and he opened the cabin door, and he called his mother's name, and he waited for an answer. There was no answer. There were, however, 3 knocks. He told Calvin Pruitt about it the next morning at the feed store. In a voice Calvin said he had never heard from another living man. He said the knocks came from somewhere below the floor, deep below the floor, somewhere in the joists or under the hearthstone, and that they were not loud, but they were emphatic, the way a person knocks when they have been waiting a long time and they would like for you to open the door. 3 knocks. Then, silence. Then, after a count he could not give a number to, 3 more. He left the ridge that afternoon and never came back. Nettie was never found. Her Bible stayed open. Her coffee went cold. The stove, by some small mercy, went out on its own. The county sealed the cabin in 47 after another search and another failure to find her, and they put a padlock on the door that lasted, by Calvin Pruitt's memory, exactly 11 days before it was found lying in the yard, open, with the hasp still attached to the frame. They put another padlock on. It lasted 9 days. They put a third. That one held, but in 59, a young couple looking to buy cheap land reported that they had stood on the porch at twilight and heard, very clearly through the closed door, 3 knocks and a woman's voice, speaking low, almost singing, calling for someone named Albert to come home. Calvin said he was 20, when the first time he heard it himself. He was up the ridge that summer scouting ginseng. He had stopped at the cabin for water, the way ginseng hunters do, at any spring or cistern they can find in the woods. He did not go inside. He stood on the porch. He cupped his hands under the rain barrel. He drank. He was about to leave when he heard the knocks, very close. from somewhere behind the kitchen wall, and he said that for a long moment, in the blue shadow of the porch, he could not tell whether they were coming from inside the cabin or from inside himself. After that, he said, I went down the ridge, and I did not stop until I got to the church, and I have not been back since. He paused and drank from a can of Pabst and looked out the window of the feed store toward the ridge, which from where we sat was just the dark blue line of the trees against an even darker sky. She is still up there, he said. I don't know what she is waiting on, but she is waiting. And she is not alone. There is another thread to the Possum Trot Ridge story, and it is a thread that Calvin Pruitt did not, in his later years, like to pull. It concerns a cabin that sat perhaps a half-mile lower down the same ridge, on a small flat just above the road, on the property that Calvin's brother-in-law, a man named Garland Sizemore, had bought in 1949 from the heirs of a family who had been driven out by the original haunting on the upper end of the ridge. Garland had bought the place because it was cheap. He had bought it because, as he liked to say, a place that had been emptied out by a haunting was the kind of place a man could get some peace in. He had joked about it, in the way that people in those hills joke about the long patient things of the ridges, and he had moved his wife and his 2 small daughters into the cabin in the spring, and he had not, at first, noticed anything strange about the place at all. What he noticed first was the dogs. He had 2 dogs, a coonhound and a small feist. They had been, in his own house at the lower end of the ridge, ordinary dogs. They had slept on the porch. They had barked at passing cars. They had treed the occasional opossum in the backyard. They had, in short, behaved the way ordinary mountain dogs behave. After 2 weeks in the cabin Garland had bought on the upper Possum Trot, they had begun to behave differently. They had begun to go quiet at certain hours. They had begun to refuse to go out in the evening past the woodpile. They had begun, on 2 occasions, to come inside unprompted, late at night, and to sit on the floor of the kitchen, in a tight group, with their ears pinned flat and their eyes on the kitchen door, and neither Garland nor his wife, both of whom had grown up in the county, could explain why the kitchen door was the door the dogs were choosing to watch. And then Garland's younger daughter, who had been 4 when they moved into the cabin, began to talk about a man in the upstairs. She did not use the word upstairs with any inflection. She used it the way she used the word porch, as if it were a place like any other place in the house, a place where a person could go. She would say, in the evenings, after dinner, that the man upstairs was making noise, and she would point, calmly, in the direction of the stairs. Garland would go up, and he would walk the empty bedroom at the top of the stairs, and he would look in the closet, and he would look under the bed, and he would come back down, and his daughter would say, patiently, that the man was in the bedroom again, and would Garland please ask him to be quiet, because she was trying to sleep. Garland did not, at first, believe her. He assumed the girl was making up stories, the way children sometimes make up stories about empty rooms. He talked to his wife about it. His wife told him, in the careful voice of a woman who had grown up in the lower end of the same ridge, that the girl was not making anything up. His wife told him that the older girl, who was 6, had been having a similar experience for several weeks. His wife told him, in the same careful voice, that she herself had been hearing, on certain nights, the 3 slow knocks that had been the long rumor of the upper end of Possum Trot Ridge for as long as anyone in the county could remember. The 3 knocks did not, on the nights they came, sound like anything else. They did not sound like the wind. They did not sound like a tree branch falling against the outside wall. They did not sound like the contraction of old timber in cold weather. They sounded, by every description Garland could later give, like a man's knuckles against pine. Deliberate, well-spaced, patient, and coming from a point that was sometimes on the outside of the cabin and sometimes on the inside, and that was, on the most unsettling occasions, somewhere on the stairs between the two floors. Garland left the cabin in 1950, 3-4 years after he moved in. He moved his family to the lower part of the ridge and put a for sale sign on the cabin in the spring. The sign stayed up through the summer and into the fall. Nobody bought the cabin. In 1954, a young couple who had been married that summer took the place for a token rent, and they were out within 3 months. They told almost no one what had happened, except the man who worked at the feed store in Harlan, who happened to be the nephew of Calvin Pruitt. The nephew told Calvin. Calvin told me, in the easy way of an old man telling me what he had heard from other old men, that the cabin at the upper end of Possum Trot Ridge was a cabin that no one should ever have tried to live in again, and that the long patient thing that lived in it had never, in the time he had been on the ridge, been driven out of it, and that every attempt at living in it had, in the long quiet of the place, ended in the same way. He said, with the long quiet certainty of a man who had watched the whole slow history of the upper end of the ridge, that the knocking was the knocking of a place reminding itself who it belonged to, and that the place had, by long custom, belonged to the dead, and that the dead, in those mountains, did not share. I sue. What stands at the tree line if you grew up in these mountains the way I did, on a little tributary holler off the French Broad, with a great-grandmother who had been born in a one-room cabin before the railroad came through? You learned a particular word very young. The word was boundary. Not the boundary of a yard or of a property line. The other kind, the line where the tree growth stops and the dark of the deep woods begins. Old folks used the word like a fence. They said things like, stay out past the boundary and you will not come home. And they said it casually, the way they said don't touch the stove, and you did not ask what they meant, because you could see in their eyes that whatever lived out past the boundary had a name for them, and the name was not one they intended to give you. My great-grandmother was named Ezra Lee, and she lived to be 97. In all those years, by her own admission, she never walked more than 40 feet past the boundary of her own porch after sundown. Not because she was afraid, not because she was old. She was, by all accounts, a hard woman, lean as a fence post, sharp as a fillet knife, who had buried a husband and 2 infants and a brother, and who had not, so far as I could ever tell, lost a fight of any kind. But the boundary was a different matter. The boundary was a thing you did not negotiate with. Whatever that is, she told me once when I was 11, when I had asked her what lived in the dark between the edge of her yard and the tree line. And I had asked her, I should say, in a manner that was meant to be clever, meant to make my older cousins laugh, and that very nearly cost me 2 weeks of staying inside after school. It watches. It doesn't come in. You don't go out. That is the arrangement. When she said the arrangement, she used the word as if it had been ratified by some older authority. I never did find out whose. She died without telling me, but the figure at the tree line is one of the most common threads in Appalachian ghost lore. Almost every county I have visited, from the Clinch to the Kanawha to the New River, has some version of the same story. A man, a shape, a thing just far enough back in the trees that you cannot tell what it is, but close enough that you can tell it is looking. Sometimes it is described as tall, sometimes as pale, sometimes it has no face, sometimes it has a face that is wrong. It never crosses the boundary. It never needs to. Its job, apparently, is to be there. A retired school teacher named Ruth Ann Combs told a version of the story to a friend of mine in Boone, North Carolina, and I want to retell it here because Ruth Ann was the most careful narrator I ever met in those mountains. She did not embellish. She did not theorize. She reported, the way a surveyor reports. She was a girl of 12 in the summer of 1960. 2. Her family lived on a bottom below Beach Mountain, on a stretch of the old county road that is now under the reservoir. They had no close neighbors. Her father worked nights at the lumber mill in Elk Creek, and her mother kept house, and Ruth Ann had the run of the place in the long summer evenings. She was the kind of girl who liked to play alone. She knew the property from one end to the other. She knew where the raspberries grew. She knew where the copperheads basked. She knew where the path to the spring house ran out into the woods, and where it ended, and where after that point she was not supposed to go. On the night in question, her mother had put her younger brother to bed, and was herself sitting on the porch shelling butter beans into a tin washtub. Ruth Ann was lying in the grass near the fence with her ear to the ground, listening to whatever it is that children listen to in the warm dirt at dusk. Above the ridge, the sky was still blue, but the woods below the house had already begun to do that thing the woods do in those mountains when the light fails. It was as if somebody had pulled a curtain across the lower branches, and the dark had come in from underneath. She said the crickets had been going all at once, and then they had all stopped at the same instant. The silence was so total that she could hear her mother's hands going in and out of the beans. She sat up. At the tree line, 60 yards down the slope from the house, a figure was standing between two box elders. It was not tall. It was not short. It was not wide. It was not narrow. Ruth Ann told my friend that the strangest thing about it, the thing that made her certain she was not looking at a person, was that it had no texture. It was the color of wet bark, but it did not have the rough surface of bark. It was the color of fog, but it did not move. It was as if the air in that exact spot had taken on the rough shape of a man and decided to hold still. It was watching her. She was certain of that. Not in a hostile way, not in a curious way. It was watching her the way a man watches a fire, with the long, patient, half-attentive focus of a creature that has been at its station for a long time and expects to be there for a long time still. She did not scream. She did not call for her mother. She sat in the grass, holding her breath, and looked back at it. And after what she said was a couple of minutes, but what she also said might have been an hour, the figure stepped backward, just one step, and was gone between the two box elders, and the crickets started again. She went inside and said nothing. She went to bed. She never told her mother. She told no one for 37 years. When she finally told the story, she told it in a voice that did not shake. And she ended it by saying, "I do not know what it was. I do not think it meant me harm. I think it was doing what the holler told it to do, and the holler told it to stand there and watch. That is the only kind of explanation that fits what I saw. I have heard this story, or stories very much like it, told perhaps 24 times in the years since. Always at the tree line. Never in the yard. Never across the fence. The arrangement my great-grandmother called it. I have begun to think she was right. Whatever stands at the boundary has a job. It does not come into your yard. It does not walk your garden. It does not come up onto your porch. It stands. It watches. And when you go out, very late, very tired, very far from home, in a hollow where the boundary fades past recognition, it is there. It has always been there. And the most disturbing thing about it, the thing I cannot shake, that I carry with me into every dark hollers I have ever walked, is the expression on its face when you see it. The expression is recognition. It has been waiting for you, specifically. It has been waiting a long time. And now, you are here. There is another tree line where something stands, and it is not far from the one I have already told you about. It is in fact on the same ridge, in the next county over, on a stretch of the Unakis that the families in that part of the ridge have been quietly watching in their own way since before the white settlements. The witness in this case is a woman named Lucinda. She told me her story on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen of a house on the Upper Tellico, with the wood stove ticking and the wind outside pressing against the kitchen window in long, slow gusts. She was 71 when she told it. She had been born on a farm in the next county over, on a piece of bottom land near the Upper Hiwassee, and she had grown up in a family that had, like many of the families of the Unakis, weathered several generations in the same house, and that had, by long habit in that family, kept close watch on the woods at the edge of the bottom. Lucinda said that she saw the figure at the tree line for the first time when she was 26, in the autumn of 1969, on the evening of a Saturday in late October, in the ordinary circumstances of her ordinary life. She had gone out to the woodpile behind the house to bring in an armful of kindling. The evening was still. The sun had set, but the dark had not yet closed the bottom. She had walked out past the corner of the house, past the kitchen garden, out past the fence, out toward the woodpile, which stood perhaps 40 yards from the back door of the house, on the edge of a small clearing that gave way, on the other side, to the heavy second growth cover of the lower hardwoods, and, beyond the hardwoods, to the laurel, and to the upper slope of the ridge. She said she saw the figure the moment she came around the corner of the house. The figure was standing in the trees, on the far side of the clearing, perhaps 70 yards from where she was standing. It was not, by her careful description, exactly the color of the trees. It was, she said, the color of an absence in the trees, the color the trees would have if a piece of the trees had been carved out of the back of the dark and lit, very faintly, from behind. It had the shape of a person. It had the height of a person. It had, by her careful later description, the kind of stillness that a person has when the person is not, in any ordinary sense, breathing. She did not, she said, become frightened. She became, instead, in the way that older mountain people become when the woods bring out something that the woods has been keeping. Very still, she stood at the fence line. She did not go to the woodpile. She did not call out. She watched the figure, and the figure watched her, and the watching went on, by her own count, for what she estimated as 3 minutes, but what she said might have been longer. The figure did not move. The figure did not, by her observation, even breathe. It stood in the soft amber color of the empty space it occupied, and it watched her with what Lucinda, in the years since, has come to describe as the patient attentiveness of a creature that had been asked very long ago to watch, and that had been doing its watching very carefully in this exact place for many, many years. And then, slowly, with no sense of hurry, the figure turned its head, not its body, its head. It turned its head on the long slope of the shoulders until the line of where a face would have been was pointed directly at her. Lucinda said, on the Sunday afternoon she told me the story, that the turning of the head was, by a considerable margin, the most unsettling part of the experience. It was, she said, the moment at which she was certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the figure was a person, and that the person was paying attention to her, and that the person had been doing so for long enough that the paying of attention had become the person's work. She went inside the house. She closed the kitchen door. She did not, that night, return to the woodpile. She did not, for the rest of the autumn, go out past the kitchen garden after sundown. She did not, in the winter, walk the perimeter fence line at dusk. She had, by her own account, taken the warning. And she had, in the careful way of the older families of the Unakis, modified her habits in such a way that the figure, however long it intended to keep watching, would not find her watching back. Then, in the spring of the following year, on a Saturday evening in late April, she saw it again. The figure was in the same place. It was, by her careful later description, exactly the same shape, exactly the same color, exactly the same stillness, and it was, by her careful observation, engaged in exactly the same activity. It was standing in the trees, on the far side of the clearing, watching her. She did not this time even register surprise. She went back into the house. She told her mother in the kitchen that the figure was back. Her mother, who had grown up in the same house, and who had, by her mother's own later account, seen the same figure at least twice in the years before she was married, said nothing. She nodded. She put the kettle on. The two of them sat in the kitchen for an hour, with the light low, and they did not, on the evening of that Saturday in April, go out again past the kitchen garden. Lucinda told me, on the Sunday afternoon, that she had not seen the figure a fourth time. She said with the sound of a wind pressing against the kitchen window in the background, that she had not, in the 49 years since that spring, walked the perimeter fence after sundown. She said she had, in those 49 years, continued to live in the same house, and that the house had, by her long observation, continued to be watched, and that the watching had, by her long observation, never come out of the trees. She said, in the last minutes of our conversation, that she was not afraid of the watching. She said the watching was, in her judgment, what the woods did. She said the woods had been watching her family long before her mother's mother had been born, and the woods would be watching long after she was gone. She said, with a kind of patient, and to me, unforgettable acceptance that comes only from long residence in a watched place, that the figure was not, in any careful sense, a stranger. The figure was a long familiar, and the long familiarity, she said, was its own kind of comfort. The three, the Greenbrier ghost and the woman on the stand in the spring of 1897, in a small frame house on a back road near Lewisburg, West Virginia. A young mother by the name of Zona Heaster Shue died one December night under circumstances that her husband Edward reported as natural. She had, he said, simply stopped breathing. He had found her on the floor, cold, and he had laid her out, and he had called the neighbors, and she had been buried in the family plot at the edge of the meadow. His mother's suspicions began almost immediately. She did not believe Edward's story. She believed the story that the young woman had been afraid of her husband, that she had come to her mother several times in the months before her death with bruises on her arms and a haunted look in her eye, and that whatever had happened on the night Zona died had not begun that night at all. It had begun much earlier, in a long pattern of quiet abuse in a small house, and it had ended with the woman on the floor and the man standing over her doing nothing at all. The body had already been buried when the suspicions hardened. So the mother did a thing that, in those mountains, was not entirely unusual. She went to the grave at night. She spoke to her dead daughter, and by her account, in a sleepless account she gave to a neighbor about a week later, the daughter spoke back. The woman whose daughter had been murdered. And it was murder, although at this point nobody in the county knew it yet, because the body had been interred without examination, reported that she had seen Zona 3 nights in a row at the foot of her bed, in a long white dress, calm, with the soft expectant look of a person about to deliver an important piece of news. And that, on the 3rd night, Zona had told her, clearly and in plain English, that Edward had broken her neck, that he had grabbed her by the throat and twisted, that the bruise on the side of her neck had not been a bruise, but the imprint of his hand, and that the mother should not rest until the body was exhumed. It sounds, in this century, like the sort of thing a grieving mother might convince herself she had seen. In the mountains of Greenbrier County at the close of the 19th century, when the oral traditions of the Cherokee were still old in the soil and the Scots, Irish traditions of speaking to the dead had not yet been laughed at into silence. This kind of testimony was not impossible. It was, in fact, not unusual. It was what you did when the law proved inadequate. You went to the grave. You asked. The body was exhumed. A physician named George W. Knapp examined the remains. He found, to his evident surprise and to the considerable surprise of the assembled coroner's jury, that the throat had been dislocated in a manner consistent with violent manual pressure. The hyoid bone was broken. The upper cervical vertebrae had been rotated forcibly. Whatever Zona's husband had done to her on that December night, it had not been nothing at all. It had been a deliberate, sustained, manual strangulation. Edward Shue was put on trial in January of 1898, and the mother, Mary Jane Heaster, took the stand. Under direct examination, she said calmly that she had seen her daughter, that the daughter had spoken to her, that the daughter had told her what Edward had done. Counsel for the defense objected. The judge allowed her to testify. The jury, in Greenbrier County, in the hills of West Virginia, in the waning winter of a long decade, did what juries in those hills have always done when the evidence is right and the testimony sounds true. They believed her. Edward Shue was convicted of murder. He served his time. He died in prison in 1905. The case became famous in folklore as the only murder in American legal history in which the testimony of a ghost was admitted and, by all accounts, made the difference between a man walking free and a man being hanged. But that is not, in the long view, the scary part of the story. The scary part of the story is a small detail that is sometimes left out of the retelling, and that, when it is left out, makes the whole thing sound like a quaint little piece of mountain superstition. The detail is this. Mary Jane Heaster did not go to her daughter's grave once. She went 3 nights in a row. And each time, the appearance was not what you would expect from a person's first frantic attempt to communicate from beyond the veil. It was calm. It was patient. It was the appearance of a woman who had already decided what she was going to say, who had thought carefully about what words to use, and who had chosen her witness carefully. Zona's ghost behaved, in other words, like a person with a case to make. And the detail that comes after that one, that is even worse. The body, when it was exhumed, was not the body of a woman who had just been strangled. The decomposition was consistent with a death several weeks earlier than December, by which, of course, the obvious implication is that Edward Shue had killed his wife some time before the night on which he had reported finding her on the floor. He had kept her in the house. He had given some explanation. He had then staged a death. And the mother's visit to the grave had come, in the sequence of horror, well after the crime. And the dead woman had, by her own reported testimony, not been confused about the timing. She had not given the mother a wild testimony. She had, over the course of 3 patient nights in the dark of the bedroom, delivered what was, in effect, a deposition from a witness who knew the difference between the truth and a lie. The skeptics, of course, will have a dozen explanations. And I will not pretend there isn't a kind of explanation in the grief and the long nights in a woman's bedroom. But the fear of the Greenbrier ghost is not that there was a ghost. It is what a ghost like that, if ghosts are real, would have to imply about the patience of the dead, about the deliberateness of the dead, about the long, careful watchfulness of the dead. in a place where the living forget to be careful, and the land itself remembers. And this is the part that the old people in Greenbrier County used to say when they were sitting on a porch after a funeral. They used to say that Zona did not come back only once. They used to say that, on certain nights in Greenbrier, you can hear a woman's voice in the cemetery at the edge of the meadow, very low, very patient, going over what she knows, the way a witness goes over testimony before a trial that matters. There is a related story, told in a neighboring county, that did not have the courtroom of the Greenbrier case, and that did not have the sworn testimony of Mary Jane Heaster, but that has, in the family record of the families of Pocahontas County, a very similar shape. The family in this case is a family named Kiner. They lived on the Upper Greenbrier, on a small farm near the head of the river, on a piece of ground that had been in their family for 4 generations by the time the events in question took place, in the late 1890s. The family at the center of the events was a family of 8 children, with the 2 oldest in their 20s and married, and the rest at home, and with the mother and father of the 8 still living in the long frame house on the bottom land. The mother of the family, by then in her late 40s, died in the spring of 1896 of a long fever that no physician in the county had been able to diagnose, and that the family, in the careful language of mountain people, described as a wasting. The mother had been buried in the family plot, on a small rise behind the house, near the sycamores, in the ordinary way of those hills, on a Tuesday in late April. The family returned to the house. The house went back to its ordinary routines. The father of the 8, a man named Ezekiel Kiner, took up, in the slow weeks after the burial, the work of the farm. The older sisters took up the work of the kitchen. The younger children went back to school. And 3 nights after the burial, on a Friday in late April, with the weather still cool and the spring rains not yet come up to full season, the family heard, in the back of the house, in the kitchen, 3 knocks. 3 slow knocks, from a place on the outside wall of the house, beside the dining table, at about the height of a person's shoulder. The knock sounded, by every account of the family, like a knuckle on pine. The oldest of the children, by then a married woman of 24, walked to the back of the house. There was no one there. The wall, when she examined it by lamplight, was undisturbed. The pine, when she passed her hand over the spot from which she had heard the knocks, was smooth and cold. There was no mark on it, and there was no figure visible in the evening light that was then fading over the fields behind the house. The knocks recurred on the following nights in the careful pattern of the long Appalachian haunting. They appeared on the outside walls of the house. They appeared on the inside walls of the house. They appeared on the woodwork of the kitchen. They appeared, with increasing deliberateness, in the rooms where the mother had spent the most time in her last months: the kitchen, the small dining room, the room in which she had slept. They did not appear at any great frequency. They appeared, by the family's long count, 3 times in the first week, and twice in the second, and then not again until, by some lower rhythm of recurrence, they returned in the 3rd week, on a night when the family was gathered, in the late evening, at the kitchen table, telling stories in the ordinary way of mountain families in those hills. And on that night, the family heard a voice. The voice was the voice of the mother. It called, from the kitchen doorway, the name of the youngest daughter, who was then 9. The eldest daughter walked to the doorway. There was no one there. The doorway, by lamplight, was empty, and yet the voice had been unmistakably her mother's voice, and it had said the youngest daughter's name in the careful, affectionate tone of a mother calling a child, very softly, to come to bed. The youngest daughter was, by her own account years later, awake at the kitchen table during the episode. She heard her name called. She did not, by her own later admission, feel frightened. She felt, she said, that her mother was in the house again. She felt it the way you feel, she said, when a family member who has been away returns from a long trip and the household begins, slowly, to settle back to its old rhythms. The household had, by the calling of the name, begun to settle back. The family consulted no one outside the immediate family. The family did not, by their later account, see any reason to consult anyone. The mother was buried. The mother was, by the long custom of the family, expected to remain in the family plot. By the sycamores, tending her grave, the mother had apparently, by the testimony of the events, returned to the kitchen. The family accepted, by long custom, that the dead do what the dead do, and that what the dead do is not always within the reach of the living to understand, and that the dead, in any event, return when the dead have their own reasons for returning, and that the proper response, in those mountains, is not to chase the dead out, but to let the dead be the dead, in their own time, in their own way, and to trust, as the older families in those hills have always trusted, that the dead know, by long custom, what they are doing. The voice, by the careful family record, did not return after that single Friday night. The three knocks did return, however, in a small, sporadic way, for several more years, most often on the anniversary of the death, and most often from a place in the kitchen that the mother had used, in her living years, as a particular sitting place near the wood box. The three knocks, when they came, would come in the late evening, after the family had gone to bed, and they would come 3 times, slowly, and then they would be quiet. The family, by the time the knocking had settled into its small, irregular pattern, had incorporated the knocking into the ordinary rhythm of the kitchen. The younger children grew up hearing the knocking. The older grandchildren heard the knocking. The knocking, by the late 1900s, had become, in those hills, an old familiar sound, and the sound, in those hills, was not the kind of sound that the families of the Upper Greenbrier turned away from. IV, the hollow where whistles die there, is a rule in the Appalachian Mountains that, on the surface, sounds like a piece of harmless country superstition. You do not whistle after dark. You do not whistle in the woods. You do not whistle near a graveyard, near a creek, near a cemetery, near a cabin that has been empty a long time. The reason given, when a reason is given, varies. Some say it will call a snake. Some say it will call the rain. Some say it will call something that answers, and the answer is not the wind. But the rule in the older hollers has a darker subtext, and the subtext is what you are about to hear. In 1976, in the back of a Bell County holler called Cane Hollow, there was a man named Doyle Hensley, no relation, so far as anyone could later establish, to the Nettie Hensley of Possum Trot Ridge. But the coincidence of names was a thing that bothered some of the older people in the county for the rest of their lives. Doyle was 23. He was a sawyer at the planing mill in Pineville. He had grown up in the holler. He knew the trails. He knew, as every child of these mountains knew, the rule about whistling. He had heard it from his grandmother. He had heard it from the deacon at the Free Will Baptist Church. He had heard it from the older boys at the country store. He did not, by his own later admission, believe the rule. One Friday night in October, he and 2 friends, brothers named Troy and Willard Mullins, were driving an old Ford pickup up the ridge above Cane Hollow, headed for the still of a man named Buckshot Bratcher, who had, by reputation, the cleanest white lightning in the county. They had been drinking beer at a high school football game in Pineville and were in the mood for what Doyle's mother would have called company. The road up the ridge was a single lane of gravel that ran along the high east fork of Stone Mountain, with the woods on one side and a sharp drop on the other. There was no moon. The fog was lying flat on the road, exactly low enough to catch the headlights in a way that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Troy, who was driving, was a whistler. He whistled constantly. He whistled in church. He whistled at work. He whistled, his brother once said, when he was angry, when he was happy, when he was frightened, when he was bored. It was, in Doyle's words, like having a canary in the cab of the truck. On the night in question, with the windows down, with the holler fog coming in off the ridgetop, Troy was whistling long, low, wandering Appalachian melodies, the kind that sound like somebody walking on a railroad track at dusk. Willard, the older brother, told him to stop. Troy did not stop. Willard told him a second time. He was not, as Doyle later said, a man easily moved to fright. And his voice that night carried the unmistakable edge of a man who had been afraid at some earlier part of his life and had learned the lesson. Troy still did not stop. Willard reached across the cab and put his hand over his brother's mouth. Troy pushed him back. The truck swerved. Doyle, who was sitting between them, said he felt a sudden change in the air. Not temperature, not wind, but something else. Something he would later describe, awkwardly, as a thickening. And then, from somewhere in the woods below the road, very close. Close enough that Doyle said he could have reached out the passenger window and touched the branches. Another whistle answered. Doyle said it was not an echo. The pitch was wrong. The melody was wrong. The tempo was wrong. And the sound was, in some way he could not specify, more breathy than a human whistle, as if the throat producing it were larger than the throat that had produced Troy's melody, and wetter and older. Troy stopped whistling. He stopped moving. The three of them sat in the truck and listened. The whistle did not sound again from the woods. The fog lay on the road. The truck was idling. Doyle said he could feel Willard's hand on his knee shaking. Then Troy, slowly, half involuntarily, the way a man absent-mindedly taps a foot, started to whistle again. He did it without realizing he was doing it, the way a man bites a fingernail. Doyle saw his face. Troy had not meant to start. He had not planned to. His lips had begun to move of their own accord, and a low sound, almost inaudible, had begun to come out of him. The second time, the reply from the woods was immediate. And it was not a whistle. It was a voice, a woman's voice, low, almost singing, calling a name down into the holler. The name was Doyle's mother's, not her full name, not the name the neighbors called, the name that only Doyle and his brothers and his mother's mother before her would have known. The old name, the milk name, the porch name, the name that no one outside the immediate family had ever heard. Doyle said at that moment he understood the rule about whistling. He said he understood it in his bones, the way a child understands the rule about not touching the stove. He did not have it explained to him. He did not have to think about it. He knew. Willard shoved Troy away from the wheel, threw the truck into gear, and drove the rest of the way to Buckshot Bratcher's still, without a word spoken. Buckshot, who was an older man and who had grown up in the holler, took one look at the three of them as they came up out of the fog and poured them each a half pint without being asked. None of them wanted the beer they had come for. They wanted the moonshine. They wanted, as Doyle said later, something with a proof in it that felt like it was capable of burning the sound out of the air. They drank. They drove home. Willard made Troy sleep in the same bed as him that night, and Troy, who was a stubborn man and not given to being afraid of anything, did not argue the point. Troy whistled for the rest of his life. He whistled in the daytime. He whistled in his shower. He whistled in the garden. He did not, after that night in Cane Hollow, ever whistle at dusk, never again on a foggy mountain road, and never again when he was alone. He did not, he said. want to find out what was waiting in the woods on the other side of the hill. He had heard his mother's name called from a place where no one knew it, and he had been given enough proof for one lifetime. Willard died in 2003. Troy died in 2012. Doyle lives, and he was the one who told this story late one night on the porch of his trailer near the mouth of the holler, with a glass of iced tea in his hand and the radio playing a distant baseball game in the background, and the woods behind his trailer, almost black, almost silent, with no one whistling in them at all. There is another hollow where whistles die, and it is not the same hollow I told you about in the earlier chapter, but it is, in the long history of the Central Appalachian Ridge, a hollow of the same kind. The hollow is on the upper reaches of Barkley Creek in Bell County, near a place called Tajay, and the rule about whistling there is older than any of the churches in the hollow and older, by the long reckoning of the older families of the watershed, than the white settlement itself. The story in this hollow is anchored to a particular woman, a granny figure named Azalee Saylor, who was born in the hollow in 1887 and who lived her entire life in the same small cabin at the foot of the ridge, and who died in 1971 at the age of 80. For Azalee, by every account of the older families of the hollow, was a sharp, thin, spry woman who had, in her long life, attended more births than anyone in the watershed, and who had, in the long, careful way of the granny women of those ridges, known by long experience what the woods at the head of Barkley Creek did and did not do, and what the woods in particular did after dark. Azalee taught the rule to her children on her deathbed. She did not, on that evening in 1970, 1. Teach the rule in any dramatic way. She taught it the way the older women of those hills teach the most important things, quietly, in a matter of fact voice, in language that did not, in any ordinary way, invite argument. She said, in the hours before she died, that her children were not to whistle at night in the upper reaches of the hollow. She said her grandchildren were not to whistle at night. She said her great-grandchildren, who were still small, were not to whistle at night when they were old enough to take an interest in the woods. She said, in the same low matter of fact voice, that the woods at the head of Barkley Creek did not, in the ordinary sense of the warning, like the sound of a whistle, and that the woods, when they heard a whistle, would sometimes answer, in their own long, slow way, in a voice that resembled the voice of the whistler, and that the answer had, in several instances that she could name from her own memory of the hollow, drawn the whistler into a place in the woods that the whistler had not intended to go. The reason she gave was the same reason that the families have given in those hills for as long as the families have been in the hollow. The reason was that the woods in the upper reaches of Barkley Creek are not empty. The reason was that the woods have, in the long custom of those mountains, a kind of tenantry. The reason was that the tenantry, whatever it is, has been in the woods longer than any family alive, and that the tenantry has, by long custom, taken an interest in the people who walk the ridges, and that the tenantry has, by long custom, been patient about it. Azalee's granddaughter Delpha, who is still alive, and who lives in the same hollow, told me the story one afternoon in the late summer of 23, in the kitchen of the house that Azalee had lived in, with the kettle on the wood stove and the rain coming up the ridge in long, slow sheets. Delpha said, in the easy, unhurried voice of an old mountain woman telling me about the kind of thing her grandmother had taught her, that the rule had held for the family. She said her children did not whistle at night in the hollow. She said her grandchildren did not whistle at night in the hollow. She said, in her easy, long, unhurried way, that there had been 2 occasions in the years she had been the keeper of the house when someone had whistled against the rule. and that both occasions had, by her own careful observation, answered back. In the first occasion, in the late 70s, one of her older boys had whistled on the upper ridge, hunting late into the autumn dusk. He had whistled at turkey, in the ordinary way of mountain hunters. The woods on the upper ridge had whistled back. The boy had come home in a sweat. He had not, by his own later admission, whistled at the upper ridge since. In the second occasion, in the late 90s, a teenage grandson had been walking the perimeter fence at dusk and had, in the easy teenage way of boys of a certain age, whistled at nothing in particular, in the general direction of the upper laurel. The laurel had answered with a woman's voice. The voice had said, very softly, very directly, 2 words in a language that the boy could not, in any careful listening, place. The boy had not whistled at the upper ridge since. The boy is a man of 47 now, and Delpha told me, in the kitchen of the cabin, that the boy will not, in any circumstances, walk the perimeter fence line at dusk, and that the rule in that family is the rule, and the rule in those hills has held for as long as anyone in the family can remember. And the rule is not a superstition in the family's careful account. The rule is, in the family's careful account, a kind of stewardship. The rule is, in the family's careful account, what you do to keep the woods at the head of Barkley Creek in their own long, patient way, and what you do to keep the woods, by long custom, on your own side of the boundary. V. Tommy Knockers and the mine that sang for more than a century, the coal miners of Appalachia have spoken of a thing that lives in the mines with them. Not a ghost, exactly, not in the way that children use the word, or the way stories around a campfire tend to use the word. A more practical thing, a working presence. The miners call it a Tommy Knocker, and they say it has lived in the deep drifts of the Appalachian coal seams since before the first Anglo miner ever swung a pick in these mountains. The Cherokee, who were here long before any white man, called it something else. They called it the keeper of the world. They said it had been charged by the old powers with watching the dark places beneath the hills, and that it was not evil so much as it was attentive, the way a foreman is attentive, the way a man who keeps records is attentive. And the miners who came after them, the Scots, Irish, the Welsh, the Germans from the Pennsylvania fields who drifted south, the Italians, the Hungarians, the Poles, took up the same idea almost without thinking about it. They named it something they could say over a beer, but they did not doubt what it was. Tommy Knockers are small. That is the first thing the miners say. They are not tall. They are not the size of a man. They are the size of a child, or the size of a kneeling man, or the size of something crouched in the dark at the working face. Their skin, when it can be seen, is dark. Gray, the color of the rock itself, as if they had grown out of the coal. Their eyes are not human eyes. Their feet, when caught in a glimpse of carbide light, do not look like feet. And they knock. 3 knocks. Always 3. The same 3 knocks that echo in the stories of the cabins in the upper hollers. But here, in the mines, the knocks are not the warning of a presence at the door. They are the announcement of a presence in the rock. They are the Tommy Knockers telling the miners that they are there. They are watching. They are in the seam. There is an old rule in the mines, passed down as carefully as the rule about whistling in the woods. You do not curse the Tommy Knockers. You do not make fun of them, not even among yourselves, not in the deep of a section, not in earshot of the coal. You speak well of them, when you speak at all, because they are, by long experience, the ones who tell you when the roof is bad. They are the ones who knock on the coal where you should not dig. They are the ones who knock on the timber before it is going to give. And the miners who listen and learn from the knocks come home, and the miners who do not listen do not. There is a particular mine on the West Virginia-Kentucky line near the head of the Tug Fork that the old miners of Mingo County will not name on the record. They refer to it as the number 2, or the Far Drift, or just the mine on the other side of the ridge. In the 1940s, when the mine was still in active production, the men who worked the third right section began to report that the Tommy knockers in that part of the mine had stopped being a series of knocks. They had started very gradually to sound like one continuous low sound, rising and falling, almost tonal, almost a song. The miners called it the slow singer. They did not all hear it. The man who heard it most clearly, by the accounts of the foreman, was a third-generation miner named Ezekiel Hatfield, who was not a religious man, who was, by his own later admission, a cusser and a brawler and a drinker of the worst kind of moonshine. He worked the night shift. He had a particular post on the section where he could be alone with the coal for hours at a time, lying on his side in a low seam with a short pick and a carbide lamp, working the face in the dark. He said, at first, that the sound reminded him of his grandmother humming hymns over a washtub. Then he said it reminded him of the wind in the chimney at the old home place. Then he stopped trying to put a melody to it and began to admit, to the men he worked with, that the sound did not remind him of anything he had ever heard. It was its own sound. It was the deep of the mine, sounding back to itself. It went on, by his count, for 7 nights. Then, on the 8th night, the roof of the third right came in. 3 men died under the fall. Ezekiel, who was on a side cut, was not one of them. He had, he said, been moved out of the section by the Tommy knockers 4 hours before the collapse, by a series of low, sharp raps on the wall beside his head, so close that he felt the vibration in his teeth. He had not understood the warning at first. He had thought it was the shift boss, signaling from the haulage. He had climbed the manway to complain. By the time he had climbed back down with the shift boss, the section was already in. And the slow singer had stopped, very suddenly, the way a man stops humming in a room where he has just realized that no one else is listening. The mine closed in 56. It has not been reopened. The entrance is in the wooded hillside above an old house place where nobody has lived since the Hatfields moved away in the 70s. The portal is caved in now, but the pour of the collapse is still visible, and the locals, when they drive the road that runs along the ridge, still slow down at the spot, and they still roll up their windows. They say the knocking is still audible even through the caved, in entrance, on certain nights in early spring, when the barometric pressure drops and the deep of the hill remembers. They say the slow singer on those nights can still be heard, very faintly, underneath the knocks. It is singing to itself, in the dark, in the place where the coal has been. And it is waiting for the next company to come and try to take it out again. There is another story, told in the same long oral tradition of the Central Appalachian mines, that does not specifically concern the Tommy knockers, and that does not concern any of the named haunting mines of the West Virginia-Kentucky line, and that does, by the long reckoning of the families of the Upper Tug Fork, concerns something else that has lived in the mine since the mines first went into the hills. The story is told in the family of a man named C.C. Justice, who worked in a mine on the upper reaches of the Tug Fork from 1939 until his retirement in 1970. C.C. told the story in a long tape-recorded interview that the Morgantown office of the West Virginia Humanities Council has preserved in 1986 in a voice that did not, by the interviewer's careful observation, waver on the central claim of the story. The central claim of the story is this: in 1947, in the spring, in a deep section of a mine that has since been sealed, a foreman named Luther Hatfield was killed by a slate fall. in a section that had, by the careful testimony of 3 other men who had been in the section with him, been a section that had, for several days before the fall, sounded in the Tommyknocker way, like a section that was about to fall. The 3 other men who had been in the section with Luther said, in their separate interviews with the Union and with each other, that they had heard the knocking. They had heard it 3 times, slowly, in the way that the Tommyknockers always knock. They had heard it, by their separate careful counts, on 3 nights in succession, from a place on the right rib of the section, at about the height of a man's shoulder. And they had, on the 3rd night, gone to Luther and told him, plainly, that the section was telling them it was no good, and that Luther should, in the careful language of the older miners, stand the men down. Luther had not stood them down. Luther had, in the easy, unhurried voice of a man who had been a foreman for 19 years, told the men that the knocks were the ordinary knocks of working coal, and that he had heard the knocks 1,000 times in his years in the mines, and that there was no need, on the basis of the knocks, to stand the section down. He had told them, in the commonplace words of a working foreman on a working day, to go home and rest and come back the next morning, when the knocks would be forgotten and the section would be, as always, working. The section came in at 4 the next morning, before the night shift had even come off the section. Luther was underneath, in the place where he had been doing the tight work that foremen do on tight days. The 3 other men were above. The slate fell the way slate falls in the deep sections of the Appalachian mines, in a single deep slide, with no warning, with a sound that the men above the section would later describe as the sound of the mountain itself opening its mouth. Luther was killed. The 3 men above survived by, as they put it in their separate interviews, the grace of the knocking that they had heard on the 3 nights before. What C.C. Justice told the interviewer was this, that in the days after Luther's death, the section was reopened by a crew of company men who did not know the story of the knocking, and that the company men who went in to recover the body found Luther's body in a posture that, by long Cherokee tradition and by long mountain tradition, was not the posture of a man who had died in a slate fall. Luther's body was kneeling, facing the right rib of the section, with his hand raised to a place on the rib that corresponded, by careful measurement, to the exact place from which the knocking had been heard by the 3 men on the 3 nights before the fall. C. told the interviewer that one of the company men who went in to recover the body had said, in a voice that did not, by C's long memory of the moment, shake, that Luther had, by his posture at the moment of his death, been responding to the knocking. That Luther had, in the long slow minutes of the collapse, gone to the place where the Tommyknockers had been telling him the right rib was about to fall. That Luther had, in the last moments of his life, gone to the place where the warning had been knocked, and that the warning, in the careful way of the older miners, had been correct. C. told the interviewer, in the last minutes of the tape, that he had, in his long career in the mines, never lost a man under his own authority to a slate fall. He attributed this, in the direct, unapologetic language of a man speaking plainly to a tape recorder in his own kitchen, to the knocking. He said that he listened to the knocking, and he stood his men down when the knocking told him to stand his men down, and he had not, in his long career, lost a man. He said, in the same plain voice, that Luther had not listened, and that Luther had been killed, and that Luther had, by his long service in the mines, known better, and that Luther had paid the price of not listening in the long, slow way that the mines charge the men who do not listen. He said, in the last minutes of the tape, that he did not know what the knocking was. He said the knocking had been in the mines as long as he had been in the mines, and that it had been in the mines longer than that, and that it would be in the mines after he was gone. He said, in the easy practical voice of a man who has spent 32 years under the mountain, that the knocking was a thing that took care of the men who listened to it, and that the men who did not listen to it were, in the long, slow account of the mines themselves, on their own. VI. The Brown Mountain Lights if you drive south on the old 2 lane from Lenoir to Marion. Somewhere around the place where State Road 18 crosses the Catawba, you will see, on your right, a long, low ridge of trees that does not look particularly different from any of the other ridges in Burke County. And if you stop, in the late evening, on a cool autumn night, and look carefully at the dark line of trees on the upper third of that ridge, you may see something that has been reported, by name and in print, since at least the 1820s, and that nobody who lives in these mountains will tell you has ever been satisfactorily explained. The lights are not ball lightning. They are not swamp gas. They are not the headlights of cars coming up from the distant highways, although they are often mistaken for that by people who have not yet learned the trick of distinguishing the genuine lights from the reflected ones. They are not reflections of distant towns, not the refracted glow of distant storms, not the misfiring of any piece of modern equipment. They hover above the dark tree line of Brown Mountain. They drift, not in any direction the wind is blowing, but sideways, in patterns that have been recorded on instruments for the better part of a century, and that have never matched any natural pattern the engineers could point to. They appear, and they vanish, and they reappear in another part of the ridge, and they have been doing so by the most careful chronicling of the Cherokee for at least 800 years. The Cherokee legend, which is the oldest legend, is that the lights are the souls of Cherokee women still searching on the ridge above the Catawba for the men who went to a battle that never ended. In some versions, the battle was a real one, a clash between rival bands in the 1600s, in which many men fell on a meadow below Brown Mountain and were buried where they fell. In other versions, the battle was so ancient that the identities of the combatants had been lost, and the women who went looking for their husbands had been searching, generation after generation, for so long that the search itself had become the lights. There is a white legend, much later, that accounts for the same lights by way of a different story. A slave master on a hunting expedition in the early 1800s had lost his way on Brown Mountain in a fog. He had been carrying a lantern. He had died of exposure. His slave had gone up the mountain to look for him and had carried his own lantern. Both had died. The lights, according to this legend, are the 2 lanterns, still ascending the mountain, still searching, still unable to find one another. But the legends do not explain what the engineers have recorded. They do not explain the fact that the lights occasionally respond to human signals, flashes, shouts, the switching on of searchlights. They do not explain the fact that, in several documented cases in the 1890s and again in the 1920s, the lights have retreated from a viewer who approached them, and that they have moved in unison, as if there were more than one, and that the unified motion of the lights has been precise enough to suggest a coordinated will. I have stood on the overlook above Brown Mountain on 3 separate occasions, in different seasons, in different years. On the first occasion, I saw nothing. On the second occasion, late on a cold November night, I saw a single light drift slowly up out of the trees on the left side of the ridge, hover, drift sideways across the ridgeline, hover again, and descend. It was amber. It was the color of a lantern. It was the color of a match struck in a draft. It was the color of nothing I have ever seen in the modern electrical spectrum. It ascended and descended with no visible means. On the third occasion, I saw 2 of them, and the 2 of them moved in tandem. They were not the same color. The larger one was amber, the smaller one was blue, white, and the smaller one, by my best estimate of the distance, was moving in a way that would have required it to pass through the canopy of the trees on the upper slope of Brown Mountain and continue into open air above the ridge. It did not pass through the trees. It was simply there, in the air, where the trees were not, again with no visible means. I will not claim to have an explanation. I am one of those observers who has had the privilege of being fairly close to the phenomenon, on the upper bridge that crosses the gorge below Brown Mountain, and I am one of those observers who can report only what he saw. What I saw, on 2 nights, did not look like swamp gas. It did not look like a reflection of headlights. It looked, in fact, like a presence in the air above the ridge, an organized presence. A presence that had about it the deliberate patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time and was accustomed to being seen, when it chose to be, by exactly the kind of person who had come up to look. When the locals tell you about the lights, they do not tell you they are frightened. They are not frightened in the ordinary sense. They will tell you in the easy conversational tone of a person describing where the good fishing is, that the lights have been there since before the white man came. They will tell you, with the same tone, that you should not call out to them. They will tell you that, if you do, on a still night, you will hear, very faintly, something answer back from the dark of the ridge. They will tell you this, and they will finish the sentence, and then they will be quiet for a little while. And the quietness, when it comes, will be the kind of quietness that settles into a room when a piece of truth has just been said, and the people in the room have decided not to test it. There is a researcher, a man named William Mabin, who spent the better part of 3 decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries making instrumented observations of the lights on Brown Mountain. Mabin was, in his day, a careful, sober observer with training in engineering and a particular interest in atmospheric phenomena. He was not, by his own extensive writing on the subject, given to speculation. He was given to measurement. His instruments, in the years of his observations, included a transithiodolite mounted on a permanent base near the upper bridge that crosses the gorge below Brown Mountain. The transit was leveled, calibrated, and oriented, and it was used by Mabin and his small staff in the careful, methodical style of 19th century observational science to triangulate the position of any light observed over Brown Mountain against the ridgeline and against the known terrain features of the gorge. What Mabin found in the years of his observations was that the lights, when they appeared, did not, regardless of the atmospheric conditions of the evening, occupy any consistent position above the terrain. They appeared at varying altitudes. They appeared at varying lateral positions along the ridgeline. They appeared, in several documented instances, at altitudes that would have required them to be, by any terrestrial explanation, in open air above the canopy of the trees on the upper slope. Mabin recorded his observations in a long series of tables and charts. The charts have been preserved by the Burke County Public Library in a small archival box that is not, in any ordinary sense, the kind of material that gets read by anyone outside the small circle of historians of the Brown Mountain phenomena. The charts are, however, in the careful preservation of the library. And the charts are, by the careful examination of anyone who has actually read them, not consistent with any single terrestrial explanation of the lights. Mabin, in the last years of his observational career, wrote a small monograph for the Burke County Historical Society that has been reprinted in the local papers from time to time. And that contains, at its closing page, a paragraph that has been quoted, with varying degrees of accuracy, by nearly every researcher who has visited the ridge since. The paragraph reads, in the Mabin monograph, that the lights are not, by his long, careful observation, ball lightning. They are not, by his long, careful observation, swamp gas. They are not, by his long, careful observation, refracted or reflected or transmitted by any atmospheric condition that he has ever been able to identify. They are not, by his long, careful observation, the headlights of cars traveling on any road that is presently in existence in Burke or any of the adjacent counties. They are not, by the evidence of his years of careful triangulation, the headlights of any vehicle that, as far as his instruments could detect, would have been constrained to the topography of the visible terrain. They are, by his long judgment, a phenomenon in the air above the ridge, of a kind that he has been unable, in his long career, to identify to his own satisfaction. The Cherokee elders who were alive during Mabin's career gave him, in several recorded conversations during the years he was visiting the ridge, the Cherokee explanation of the lights. The Cherokee explanation was, in its long, careful way, that the lights were the souls of Cherokee women, that the women were searching, that the searching had been going on for 800 years, and that the searching had not, in any of those centuries, been satisfactorily concluded. The Cherokee elders did not, in those conversations, attempt to account for Mabin's triangulation. They did not attempt to explain why the lights appeared at altitudes inconsistent with the topography of the ridge. They did not attempt to explain why the lights, on several careful occasions, responded to shouts and flares. They simply said, with the patient, and to Mabin, slightly unsettling, assurance of people who have been watching the lights for 800 years, that the lights were the lights, and that the lights were doing what the lights do, and that Mabin's instruments were interesting, and that Mabin's charts were interesting, and that Mabin's careful tables in the long, slow reckoning of the Cherokee were not going to change anything. Mabin took the Cherokee explanation as seriously as he took any other explanation. He noted in his monograph that the Cherokee explanation was not, in any scientific sense, testable. He noted in the same monograph that the Cherokee explanation had been consistent in its careful transmission across many centuries in a way that the other explanations had not. He noted, with the practical caution of a working researcher, that he had been unable, in his long career, to disprove the Cherokee explanation in any respect that would have satisfied a careful investigator. He noted, in the careful final paragraph of the monograph, that the lights were not, in his long and careful judgment, going to be explained by the kind of investigation that his instruments supported, and that the lights were, in his long and careful judgment, going to remain, for as long as the Cherokee had been watching them. The patient, long continuing concern of a place that had its own reasons for keeping them. V70. The children who saw there is a story people in the southern coalfields tell about a particular stretch of the Russell Fork, near a town the size of a postage stamp, that goes by the name of Hellier. The story is sometimes told as a piece of folklore. Sometimes it is told as a piece of testimony. The thing that makes the story different from most of the others in this book is that the witnesses were children. They were small. They were not given to exaggeration. They were not, by the standards of even a generous observer, given to lying. And there were 5 of them. It began, as so many of these accounts begin, with a knock on the door. The family in question was the family of a coal dispatcher named Lowell Mullins, who lived in 1989 in a small white farmhouse about 2 miles outside the unincorporated community of Hellier in Pike County, Kentucky. He had 4 children at home. His wife was expecting a 5th. The family attended the regular services at the regular church. The children were, by Mullins's own later description, ordinary children. They played in the yard. They went to the school down the road. They watched the cartoons in the morning and did their homework in the afternoon. They were afraid of the dark, in the way that all children are afraid of the dark. A low-grade, manageable fear that could be dispelled by a night. Light and a parental voice from the next room. Until one night in October, when the youngest, then 4, came down the stairs into the kitchen and said, very plainly, that a man had come to her bedroom window and knocked. Mullins, half asleep, asked her what man. She described him in the precise, uncomplicated vocabulary of a small child. Tall, no face, a hat that bent down at the front, like the brim of a bird's beak, hands that were dark. He had knocked on the glass 3 times, and then he had stood there, without moving, until she had called for her mother. There was no man at the window when Mullins went up to look. There were no prints on the ground below, although the night had been dry. There was nothing at all. He put the child back to bed and sat up for an hour or so, smoking on the porch, and then he went back to bed himself. He did not, at this point, think there was a problem. He thought it was a dream, until it happened again, 2 nights later. The same window, the same 3 knocks, the same man. This time, the child did not come down the stairs. She screamed. She screamed in a way that Lowell Mullins had never heard any of his children scream, in a way that he later said made his hands shake so badly he could not light a match. He ran up the stairs. The window was closed. The shade was drawn. He pulled the shade back. There was nothing there. There was nothing at the window. There was nothing on the glass. Nothing on the sill. Nothing on the ground below. On the 3rd night, 2 of the children saw it. The youngest, who had been the principal witness, still saw the man. But her older brother, who had come to her room to defend her, saw something different. He saw, he said, what looked like the same shape, only with no eyes. He could see the brim of the hat and the line of the shoulders, and the hands that were pressed flat against the inside of the glass. But where the face should have been, there was a dark place, as if the figure had been carved out of the back of the night itself, as if there had been a man, shaped absence pressed against the window. On the 4th night, all 4 of the children who were then in the house saw it, and Mullins' wife, who had come up the stairs on the older child's scream, saw it too. This time, she described it in language that did not sound like the language of a frightened mother. She described it in language that sounded like she was making an inventory. She counted the features. She counted the height. She counted the way the brim of the hat ended in a point at the front. She counted the 3 knocks, the spacing of the 3 knocks, the rhythm of the 3 knocks. And then she said, very quietly, that she was going to call her own mother, and she did. And her own mother, an elderly woman by the name of Pearlie, came over the next day and stood in the bedroom with the curtains drawn, and she did not, by her own account, see the figure. She smelled something. She described it as a smell like cold iron and wet wool. She said it was the smell of the lower mines, where the air had been stale for a long time. Mullins, who had tolerated the first 3 nights with the low-grade anxiety of a father trying to manage a child's bad dream, did a different thing on the morning after his wife had seen the figure. He borrowed a video camera from a friend at the mine. He set it up on a tripod in the older child's bedroom, with the viewfinder pointing at the window. He turned it on at dusk. He turned it off at dawn. On the 2nd night of filming, the camera, in the small hours of the morning, captured something on the tape. A low, dark shape moving across the glass of the window, very slowly, from one side to the other, casting no reflection, showing no features that could be made out, very deliberately, very patiently, as if it were looking for someone inside the room who had not yet come to the glass. I have seen the tape. It has been shown, by now, on enough cable programs and internet forums that there is little point in pretending it does not exist. The tape shows what it shows. It does not look like a man. It does not look like a coat on a hook. It does not look like the cat. It looks, most recognizably, like a thing that is in the act of trying not to be recognized. The family moved out of the house in 1991. They moved into a double-wide trailer on the other side of the county, and Lowell Mullins said, in a long interview I was able to listen to a decade later, that the phenomenon had not followed them. He was grateful for that. He did not, however, rule out the possibility that it would. His mother's mother, who had been born in the same ridge, had told him, when he was a child, that the things that watch children at windows do not give up. They simply wait, she said, for the children to grow up. And then they begin watching the grandchildren. And if the grandchildren come to the same window, in the same house, in the same holler, on the same ridge, then the knocking starts again. 3 knocks. The same 3 knocks. As if there had been no interruption at all. As if the watching had simply been going on, in the dark, in the cold iron smell, in the wet wool smell, in the patient silence of the room, waiting for a familiar face to come to the glass. There was, in the years since the Mullins family left the house on the ridge above the Harlan, a second case that came to the families of the Upper Piney in a different decade, in a different family, and with a different consequence. The case in question did not end with the families leaving. The case in question ended by the family's long, careful record of itself with the family's acceptance. The family in this case was a family named Tomlinson. They lived in a small house in the lower part of Piney Creek, in a stretch of the watershed that was, by the long reputation of the old families of the watershed, a stretch that had been, for as long as anyone in Piney could remember, watched the Tomlinson children, who were 4 in number, ranged in age, in the year of the events, from 7 to 14. The mother and father of the children had grown up on the same watershed. They had, by their own account, never, in their years of growing up on Piney, heard any of the stories that the older families told about the place at the lower end of Piney. Because the older families, in their way, did not tell those stories to young couples who were moving back into the watershed. The older families let the young couples find out on their own. The Tomlinsons found out on a Saturday night in October of 2002. They had put the children to bed. They had eaten dinner. The father of the family, a man named Kevin, had gone out to the kitchen to wash the dishes. The mother of the family, a woman named Callie, had gone up the stairs to check on the youngest, who had been unwell. The stairs were on the side of the house. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, with a narrow hallway between them. Callie had reached the top of the stairs. The lights in the upstairs hallway were off. The door of the oldest child's room was open. The door of the middle child's room was open. The door of the youngest's room was partly open. The youngest child, who was 7, had been asleep. The 7th-year-old child, who had been unwell, was sitting up in her bed with her arms around her knees, looking at the door of her own room. Callie asked her what was wrong. The child said, in the careful, direct voice of a child who has not yet learned, by careful socialization, that some things should not be said, that there was a man at the end of the bed. The man, the child said, was not her father. The man was not her mother. The man, the child said, was not in the room with her. The man, the child said, was at the end of the bed, looking down at her, from a distance that was, by the child's careful later description, perhaps a foot or 2. The man had been in the room, the child said, for what the child estimated as 5 or 10 minutes, looking down at her, with the long, patient attentiveness of a man looking at a child. Callie went into the bedroom. She turned on the light. The man, of course, was not there. Callie asked the child, in the quiet voice of a mother who has heard enough stories to take the question carefully, what the man had been doing. The child said, again in the patient, direct voice of a small child speaking plainly, that the man had not been doing anything. The man had, by the child's careful observation, been watching her. The child said, on the same plain, direct occasion, that the man had been watching her the way that people watch a fire at the end of a long day. With a kind of long, slow, absorbed attentiveness. With a kind of long, slow, not quite anything. With a kind of long, slow watching that goes all the way through. The Tomlinson family did not, in the weeks and months that followed, leave the house at the lower end of Piney. They did the opposite. They talked very carefully to the older families of the watershed. They asked questions. In the easy, respectful voice of young mountain parents asking about the long history of a place they were about to raise their children in. The older families, in the easy, long and hurried way of the older families of Piney, told them what the lower part of Piney is, and what the lower part of Piney has always been, and what the lower part of Piney, by long custom, has been watched for. They told the Tomlinsons that the lower part of Piney is, in the long oral tradition of the watershed, a place that has been watched, in a patient long way, for as long as the families of the watershed have been in the watershed. They told them that the watching is not, in any ordinary sense, hostile. They told them that the watching is, in their long experience of the watershed, gentle. In the long, slow way that a mother's attention is gentle, and that the attention, in their long experience, has a particular interest in the small children of the families that have lived in the lower part of Piney. They told them that the watching of the children is not, in their long experience, an unfriendly watching, and that the watching is, in their long judgment, what the lower part of Piney does for the people who have been in its care. The Tomlinsons accepted the explanation. They did not, in the years since, attempt to chase the watching out of the lower part of Piney. They did not, in the years since, attempt to seal the windows of the small house at the lower end of the creek. They did not, in the years since, attempt to keep their children out of the rooms in which the watching had been observed. They let the children be the children. They let the children sleep in the same rooms in which the watching had been. They let the children grow up in the ordinary way of children who have grown up on Piney Creek in the long history of the families of the watershed. And the watching continued in the long, quiet way of the lower part of Piney. And the children grew up, and the children are now adults. And the adults, by their own quiet testimony, do not, in any ordinary way, mind that the watching continued. And that the watching is, by careful observation, still in the rooms at the lower end of the creek. And that the watching is, in the long running experience of the Tomlinson family, the long patient way the lower part of Piney has of keeping the families it has always kept. Vate, the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee, of all the stories in these mountains, none is more quoted, and none is more genuinely strange than the story of what happened to the Bell family on their farm in Adams, Tennessee, in the years between 1817 and 1820. 1. It is often called the most thoroughly documented haunting in American history. It is also often called a hoax. Both descriptions are accurate, in their way. The truth, as so often in these hollers, lies somewhere between. And what lies between is not a place that the daylight mind likes to stay in very long. John Bell was an established farmer. He was a member of the Methodist Church. He had married a respectable local woman named Lucy, and together they had raised, in the ordinary way of the time, a family of children on a substantial farm on the south side of the Red River, just north of what is now Adams. The farm was good. The Bell family was comfortable. They had slaves in the ordinary way of that country and that time. They had standing in the community. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable people. The kind of people who would not, in the natural course of hill country history, have become the focus of any legend at all. It began, by every contemporary account that survives, with a knocking on the outside wall of the house. 3 knocks, as if someone were standing at the clapboards, very near the kitchen, and very politely requesting that the door be opened. Not, at first, anything more terrifying than that. Ordinary knocking, of a kind that could have been explained by the children of the neighbors playing a prank. Then the knocking moved inside the house. It moved, within 3 nights, to the bedsteads of the children. It moved to the harness hanging on the wall by the front door. It moved to the furniture in the parlor. It moved with a deliberateness that an ordinary haunting does not have. By the time the winter of 1817 had set in, the Bells' home had become a place in which every object in the house could, at any moment, produce a sound. Chains rattling, chairs scraping, beds creaking. And always, that first 3 knocks, as if the source of all of it were a single presence that had introduced itself to the family at the front door and that was now making itself at home. And then it began to speak. What spoke was a voice, a woman's voice, by the descriptions of the children and by the visitors who began to come to the farm, curious or skeptical. Throughout the following months, it came from the walls. It came from the empty corners of the room. It came from places in the house where there was no one standing. It spoke to John Bell by name. It called the children by name. It answered questions put to it by neighbors who had come to see whether the stories were true. And it was articulate, in a way that none of the witnesses had ever before encountered in any disembodied voice. It was witty. It was angry. It was, at moments, obscene. It was, at other moments, appallingly well-informed. It told Bell things he had told no one. It told neighbors things about their own affairs that they had not shared with the Bell family. It quoted scripture. It quoted local gossip. It did everything a person could do, short of presenting itself in the flesh. The entity, when it was asked, claimed to be the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, who had lived in the neighborhood, and who had quarreled with John Bell over a piece of land in the years before her death. There is no firm historical corroboration of any such woman. There are county records that suggest there was a woman of that name in the neighborhood, but the records are the ordinary thin records of a thinly settled frontier county, and they do not say enough to confirm or to deny. The entity, however, was immovable on the topic. It was Kate Batts. It had come back. It had come back because of the land. And it was going to stay. Andrew Jackson, who was at that time a United States Senator from Tennessee, and who would go on to be a President of the United States, was passing through Adams in the summer of 1819, and he stopped with a delegation of his retinue at the Bell farm. He did not, by most accounts, believe in ghosts. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a man of the law, a man who would spend his career in the empirical world of American politics. But the thing spoke to him. It knew him by name. It called him a liar. It called him a coward. It spoke to him about his own affairs, his own ambitions, his own private concerns, in a tone so intimate, so precise, and so observant that Jackson is said to have left the house shaken, with a famous remark attributed to him, more or less that he would rather face the whole British Army than that spirit again. The remark has been disputed, and it is very likely that the story was polished over the years. But the cold fact is that Andrew Jackson visited the Bell farm. And the cold fact is that he left it changed. What happened to John Bell, in the end, is the part of the story that no one in Adams likes to discuss. Bell became ill in the winter of 1820. His health declined, week by week, in a manner that physicians of the time could not diagnose. The entity throughout this period told the family, plainly, that Bell was going to die. The entity told them when. The entity told them how. And in December of 1820, John Bell was found dead in his bed. Small vials of an unknown substance were found in the house. The entity, when asked, said that it had given him the vials and that he had taken them of his own accord. The activity continued after his death. It continued after his burial. It turned, in time, on the children. It made a particular attachment to one of the daughters, Betsy, and it followed her, eventually, to the cabin of her new husband, and it settled there for a period of years, until Betsy herself, in her middle age, died of what one local account described as exhaustion. The Bell Witch story, retold for 2 centuries in those hills, has become a piece of American folklore so prominent that the cave on the Bell Farm is now a tourist destination. A roadside attraction, a place where the curious can park and eat lemonade in the parking lot, and take a guided walk down into a small opening in the rock where the entity, by local tradition, kept its bottles. The cave is small, it is ordinary, and the presence in it, if there is a presence in it, is the kind of presence that does not advertise itself. But the fear of the story, for me, is not the entity itself. It is the duration. It is the 4 years of the haunting, year after year, night after night, with the same voice in the walls, the same 3 knocks on the furniture, the same intimate knowledge of the family's affairs. It is that this thing did not pass through. It settled. It made itself a tenant. It was there, in the house, for years, and the house, in that kind of presence, stops being a house. It becomes a territory, and the people who live in it become, in some sense that I cannot fully articulate, the incumbents of a space that has another master. And the master has a voice, and the voice knows your name, and it has by now learned when you are afraid. There is an episode in the Bell Witch story that is not often told in the tourist-facing storytelling of the modern Bell Witch Cave, and that is by the careful analysis of the Adams families who have kept the record, perhaps the strangest of the long, strange episodes of the haunting. It concerns the entity after John Bell's burial, and it concerns a series of visits that the entity, by the careful long-term record, paid to John Bell's surviving family members over the course of the following winter. The first visit, by the Adams family record, occurred on a Tuesday in late December of 1820. The surviving members of the family had, by that point in the long haunting, simply tried to continue their ordinary lives with a kind of grim diligence that, in the long history of the Bell Farm, had become the rule. The surviving members had drawn the curtains. They had closed the shutters of the front parlor on the nights when the voice was loud. They had, in the easy, ordinary way of farm families who were working through a long, terrible winter, continued the work of the farm, the work of the kitchen, the work of the well, and the work of the long, slow rotation of the household in a kind of constant attendance to the small, ordinary business of living. On the Tuesday in late December, the eldest of the surviving daughters, a young woman of 19, was in the small bedroom at the back of the house, changing the bed linens of a younger sister who had been unwell. The work was ordinary. The room was quiet. The light, in the slow, ordinary way of the early winter evenings, was fading in the small panes of the window. The young woman had been working for perhaps half an hour when she became aware, with the steady, unforced attentiveness of a person who has lived in a haunted house for 5 years, and who has, by long familiarity with the haunting, become a reliable witness of its small, strange recurrences, that the entity was in the room with her. The entity, by her later record, did not speak. The entity did not knock. The entity did not produce any of the small, audible signs that had been its ordinary way of announcing its presence in the long, strange years of the haunting. The entity was, by her careful later account, simply there. It stood, by her observation, near the corner of the small bedroom in the kind of careful, not quite doing anything that the entity had, in the long, strange year, taken to as a kind of explicit signature. It watched her. It watched her the way the mimic voice in another hollow, another century later, would watch the families of the Upper Tellico. It watched her with a kind of long attention that was not, in any ordinary careful observation, hostile. It was, she said, in the careful, deliberate voice of a young woman who would, in later years, become the long-standing matriarch of the surviving Bell family in the Adams community. Attentive in the way that a person is attentive at the bedside of someone they have been asked to take care of. She did not, by her later careful account, speak to the entity on that Tuesday evening. She did not, on that Tuesday evening, attempt to leave the small bedroom. She finished the small, ordinary task of changing the bed linens. She smoothed the sheets. She walked out of the room. The entity was, by her observation as she left, in the same position at the corner of the room, watching the small, ordinary task with the same long, unforced attention. She closed the door behind her. She went downstairs. She spoke to her mother. They did not, that evening, attempt to enter the small bedroom, and the entity, by the careful Adams family record, came back the next night, and the next, and the next. And the family, in the long, frightful year, did not in any of those nights attempt to drive the entity out. The entity, in the careful, long-range observation of the family, was not doing anything the family could describe as frightening. The entity was, by the long observation, doing something closer to the patient-long routine of a person who has taken a position in a household and who has, by long patient attention to the small, ordinary work of the household, become a familiar part of the household. It is, of course, possible to be frightened by this, and the Bell family was, by every account, frightened by this, and would remain frightened, in some form, for the rest of their long, extraordinary lives. But the fear was, in the family's careful later record, not the fear of a hostile presence. The fear was the fear of a sustained presence. The fear was the fear of something that did not leave. The Adams families who kept the long record of the haunting have said, in the careful, dry way of people who have lived with the story for 200 years, that the Bell Witch was, on the long-range evidence, more patient than it was dangerous, and more attentive than it was patient, and that what it was attending to, by the long, consistent record, was the family. IX. The voice that knew my brother's name there is a story I have heard, in some form, from at least 9 separate families in 6 different Appalachian counties. The protagonist of the story varies. The location varies. The decade varies. But the central image is the same. A person is alone in the woods, somewhere in the upper hollers, in a place they know. They hear their own name called, out of the trees, in a voice that sounds at first like the voice of someone they love. Brother, sister, father, mother, the voice is clear. The voice is unmistakable. It is calling from a place they cannot see, in a direction they do not expect, in a tone that is unmistakably the voice of a person they know and who is not, as far as they can tell, anywhere in these woods at all. The Appalachian rule about this is one of the oldest rules in the book. You do not answer. You do not call back. You do not go to investigate. You do not, in any circumstances, speak the name out loud in return, because to do so is to confirm to the thing that is using the voice that it has your attention, and that you have recognized the voice, and that you have, in the moment of recognition, given up the one advantage you had over it, which is the advantage of the person who has not yet said yes. I want to tell you a version of the story that I have checked and checked with the person who lived it, and that I have permission to retell, with identifying details altered. The person's name, in this version, is Joel. He is a Methodist minister now, in a town in the middle reaches of the New River. He was 12 years old in the autumn of 1994. He was, by his own description, a boy who loved the woods. His family had a tract on the head of Klein Creek, near a place called Indian's Gap, where his grandfather had built a cabin in the early 60s, and where 3 generations of the family had hunted, fished, and tended small plots of tobacco and sweet corn. On the day of the event, Joel's older brother Jeremy, who was 21, had taken him up the ridge on a squirrel hunt. They had left the cabin before daylight. They had walked a long loop through the upper timber. They had bagged 7 squirrels between them by mid-morning. They had stopped to eat cold biscuits and a piece of jerked venison at a spring that came out of the rock above the trail on the north side of the ridge. The morning had been soft, with a low ceiling of fog and a kind of warm autumnal stillness in the air that is characteristic of those mountains in October. About an hour later, Joel's brothers sent him back down the ridge to the cabin to retrieve the canvas game bag they had left by the porch. It was a walk of about 2 miles by the trail, and Joel was not particularly concerned about it. He had walked the trail many times. He knew it well. He had his .22 rifle in his hand. He had his hound trotting ahead of him. He was perhaps halfway down the ridge, in a stretch of woods that is, on either side of the trail. Very thick second, growth hardwood, with no houses in sight, and the main ridge still rising to his right, and a long hollow dropping away to his left, when he heard, very clearly, very close, his brother's voice calling his name. Joel. Just that. No trail behind it. No come here. No over this way. Just his own name and his brother's unmistakable voice, somewhere in the trees to his right, somewhere between 30 and 50 yards away, in a direction in which he knew, by the geography of the ridge, his brother could not be. Jeremy had sent him back to the cabin. Jeremy had stayed on the upper loop. Jeremy was, by Joel's own estimate, more than a mile away by now, on the far side of the next knob. Joel stopped. He did not call back. This was the rule, and he had grown up with the rule. He had heard it from his grandfather. He had heard it from the deacon at the church. He had heard it from his mother, who had heard it from her mother, who had heard it from hers. The rule had a particular edge to it in the Klein Creek family, because Joel's great-uncle, a man named Bayard, had, as a young man, answered a voice he heard on the head of the ridge in 1967, and had walked into the timber toward the voice, and had not, by his own report, come back the same person. He had come back. He had walked out of the woods after 7 hours, but he had been, as Joel's grandfather said, with the carefully understated language of mountain people describing something that has frightened them deeply. Different. Joel stood on the trail. He listened. The voice did not repeat. The woods around him were not silent. They had the ordinary late morning sounds, a woodpecker somewhere, a red squirrel scolding from a high branch, the small movement of leaves in what little breeze was at work on that soft October morning. But there was, under the sounds, a kind of held breath quality that he later said he had not noticed until the voice had come, and that he did not notice again until the voice had passed. He waited, by his own count, for about 10 minutes. He did not call his brother's name. He did not call his own name in return. He did not take a step off the trail in the direction of the voice. He stood still, with the hound pressed against his leg, and he waited. And in that 10 minutes, with the woods around him not silent, but as if they had been listening, he understood, in a way that his great-uncle had described, but that he had not, until that moment, been able to imagine, what the rule was for. The rule was not for preventing you from being tricked. The rule was for preventing the thing that uses the voice from learning that you are present, and from beginning to attend to you, and from being patient about attending to you, in the way that only the dark of these mountains can be patient. He walked on. He reached the cabin. He retrieved the canvas bag. He sat on the porch for a little while and drank water from the dipper. He waited for his brother, who came back down the ridge in the late afternoon, 3 hours later than Joel had expected, with a small complaint about a doe that had led him on a long walk to the south side of the hollow. Joel, when his brother came into the yard, did not say anything about the voice. He waited until his brother had put the rifle down and was hanging the squirrels on the smokehouse pole, and then he told him. Jeremy, by Joel's account, did not at first believe him. But when Joel described the exact intonation of the voice, and the exact place on the trail where he had been standing when he heard it, and the exact direction it had come from, Jeremy went very quiet, and he sat down on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees, and he said, in a voice Joel had never heard from his brother before, that the place Joel was describing was the same place Bayard had walked into in 1967, in the same kind of soft October fog, on the same trail, in the same stretch of second-growth timber, not 60 yards from where Joel had stood. Joel told me, 20 years later, that the experience had not been frightening in the ordinary sense. It had been, he said, an encounter with something that had a great deal of information about him, that knew his brother's voice with perfect fidelity, that knew his name with perfect precision, and that had some specific interest in using that information to make him walk off the trail into the woods. It had been, in other words, a thing with a purpose, and the purpose had been to make him do something he was not going to do, and the doing of it had depended completely on him first acknowledging the voice, which he had not done, which, by the rule, is what you do. You walk on. You do not answer. You do not look. You let the woods have their strange moment, and you keep your feet on the trail and your breath in your chest, and you trust the rule, even if the rule is older than anyone alive can remember, even if the rule was, in the beginning, nothing more than the warning of one hunter to another, passed hand to hand across a campfire, down the years into the present, into this very soft October morning on the head of Klein Creek, where the woods, by long custom, do not answer you back. There is another hollow in the same long oral tradition, where the voice that calls the names of those who walk in the woods has been heard several times in the same decade, and where the walking of the woods has, by the long tradition of the hollow, become a practice that is undertaken only with great care, and only in the older way. The hollow in this case is the hollow of the Upper Stony in Lee County, Virginia, on a stretch of the North Fork of the Stony that is, by the careful long-range observation of the families of the watershed, one of the quieter watersheds in those parts. The Holt family has been on the Upper Stony for 5 generations. The younger generation of the Holts has, by the long habit of the watershed, tended to do its hunting on the upper ridgetops above the holler, and has, by that long habit, learned the rule of the Upper Stony, which is the rule of the Upper Klein Creek, and the rule of the Upper Elk, and the rule of the Bark Country, and the rule of almost every hollow in those hills. The rule is this: you do not answer the voice. You do not call out. You do not, in any careful response to a voice that calls your name from a place in the woods you do not expect, speak the na.
The Appalachian Mountains run for nearly 2,000 miles through hollows and ridgelines so old and so folded in on themselves that entire communities have lived, for generations, within a few miles of families they've never fully met. It's a region with its own weather, its own silence, and its own long tradition of stories about things seen in the tree line at dusk. Stories passed down not as entertainment, but as warnings, the way you'd tell a child which mushrooms not to eat. What follows are first-hand accounts from people who live, work, hike and drive through those mountains, describing the nights they saw something the hollow wasn't supposed to show them. Keep close to the fire. It gets dark early back in these hills. Story 1, The lights on Signal Ridge. Earl had lived at the base of Signal Ridge his entire life, close enough to the tree line that he could see the ridge's silhouette from his back porch every evening without needing to think about it. Most nights, nothing marked that silhouette except stars. One autumn evening, sitting out with his coffee as the light faded, he watched a series of small amber lights appear along the ridgeline, spaced with an evenness that struck him immediately as unnatural. Not headlights, not lanterns, nothing that matched any structure or road he knew to exist up there. The lights held steady for several minutes before beginning to move, not drifting the way a flashlight beam might while someone walked, but gliding, smooth and level, tracing the exact contour of the ridge before winking out one by one in the same order they'd appeared. Earl had heard his grandfather talk about lights on that ridge decades earlier, dismissed at the time as old mountain talk, and he found himself, for the first time, taking the stories seriously. He asked around the following week and learned that at least 3 of his neighbours had seen the same lights over the years, always in full, always in that same even spacing, and always without any explanation anyone could offer beyond an old, uneasy shrug and the suggestion that some things on that ridge were better left unbothered. Story 2. The hollow that went quiet deep in a wooded hollow in eastern Kentucky. Hunters had long noted a strange consistency to one particular hollow. No birdsong, no insect noise, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. A silence so complete it stood out sharply against the constant low hum of sound everywhere else in the forest. Local families had a name for it, passed down informally, and children were told from an early age not to linger there past dusk. Wade, sceptical of the old warning, decided one evening to sit in that hollow and wait, curious what, if anything, would actually happen. The silence held for nearly an hour, undisturbed, until, just as full dark set in, he heard, from somewhere close by, but indeterminate in direction, a low, guttural exhale, too deep and too deliberate to be wind, followed immediately by the abrupt return of all the forest's ordinary sound at once. Birds, insects, rustling brush, as though the hollow itself had simply exhaled along with whatever had made that first sound. Wade left quickly, and though he returned to that hollow several more times over the years out of a stubborn need to understand it, he never again heard the silence broken in quite that same way. And he has never stopped wondering what exactly held its breath alongside him that night. Story 3. The old woman at the fork driving a rural mountain road late one night, Denise came upon an elderly woman standing at a fork in the road, dressed in a long dark dress that seemed decades out of place, gesturing with one hand toward the left-hand path with slow, deliberate motions. Denise's GPS indicated the right-hand path as the correct route, but something about the woman's calm insistence made her hesitate, idling at the fork for a long moment before ultimately trusting the GPS and continuing right. She glanced in her mirror as she pulled away and saw the woman still standing there, arm still raised, now pointing more urgently. Before the darkness and the bend in the road obscured her from view, Denise made it home without incident, but mentioned the encounter to a long-time resident of the area days later, who went quiet before telling her that stretch of road had a story attached to it involving a fatal accident on the right-hand fork decades earlier, and that an old woman matching that description had been reported at that same junction by more than one driver over the years, always pointing left, always trying, as the story went, to steer people away from a road that had already taken enough from her family. Story 4. The thing that mimicked his daughter's voice camping alone in a remote stretch of the Smokies. Roger was startled late one night by the sound of his young daughter's voice calling for him from somewhere in the dark tree line beyond his campsite, calling his name with a clarity and familiarity that struck him immediately as impossible. His daughter was safely at home, hours away, and had no way of being anywhere near that campsite. He did not go toward the voice. Every piece of advice he'd ever heard about backcountry camping in those mountains surfaced at once. Warnings about things in the deep hollows that could imitate voices, family members, anything that might draw a person off the trail and into the dark. He stayed by his fire, calling back only to say he loved her and would see her soon, refusing to move from the light no matter how convincing or how desperate the voice calling from the trees became over the following 20 minutes. It eventually stopped, replaced by ordinary forest silence, and Roger called his actual daughter first thing the following morning to confirm, with enormous relief, that she had been safely asleep in her own bed the entire night. He has never camped alone in those mountains since. Story 5. The man who walked backward down the trail hiking a remote ridge trail in West Virginia. Bethany encountered a man walking toward her on the same path, moving in a manner that struck her as deeply wrong the closer he got, his feet stepping in a normal forward gait, but his body oriented and moving backward down the trail, away from the direction his legs suggested he should be travelling. He said nothing as he passed, never turning to face her directly, and continued backward down the trail until a bend obscured him from view. She hiked out quickly after that, unwilling to continue further, and mentioned the encounter to a ranger at the trailhead, who took her description with a seriousness that surprised her, noting only that hikers on that particular ridge had described similar figures over the years, always walking with that same wrong backward gait, and that the department's informal advice was simply to keep moving and never attempt conversation. Bethany has not returned to that trail since. Story 6. The cabin with no door exploring an overgrown stretch of forest in rural Tennessee. A group of friends came upon an old cabin, weathered but structurally intact, with windows on all four sides but, unusually, no door anywhere in its exterior walls. No gap, no boarded over opening, nothing to suggest a door had ever existed at all. Peering through one window, they could see a single chair positioned in the centre of an otherwise empty room, facing directly toward them despite there being no way for anyone to have set it there without an entrance. They left without attempting to enter, unsettled by the impossibility of the structure, and returned days later with a local historian who confirmed no record existed of any cabin ever having been built at that location, in any county survey or property record going back over a century. When they returned a third time to investigate further, they could not relocate the cabin at all, despite using GPS coordinates recorded on their first visit, finding only dense, undisturbed forest where the clearing and structure had stood. Story 7. The singing from the mine shaft near an abandoned coal mine in eastern Kentucky, sealed decades earlier following a collapse that claimed several lives. Hikers and hunters have long reported hearing faint singing rising from the sealed shaft entrance on certain still evenings, a low, wordless melody that several long-time residents claim to recognize as an old hymn once sung by mining families in that community. Local historian Pearl Whitfield has collected accounts of the singing going back over 40 years, always describing the same melody, always fading the moment anyone approaches closely enough to make out individual words. One young hiker, skeptical of the local stories, camped near the shaft entrance specifically to record the sound, and later shared a recording with Whitfield that, according to her, matched the described melody closely enough that she found herself unable to offer any alternative explanation. The recording has since been shared informally throughout the community, treated less as a curiosity than as a quiet, ongoing memorial nobody quite understands, but nobody wants to disturb. Story 8. The deer that walked on two legs driving a remote mountain road at dusk in West Virginia. Corey's headlights caught what he initially took for a deer standing at the tree line, only for the shape to rise onto two legs as his truck approached. Standing at a height he estimated well over 7 feet, before turning and moving into the trees with a long, unhurried stride, he did not stop to investigate. He drove on quickly, shaken, and mentioned the sighting to a long-time resident who simply nodded, unsurprised, and told him that particular stretch of road had a reputation for exactly that kind of sighting going back generations, always described the same way, and that the standing local advice was simple: don't stop, don't look too long, and don't ever try to get a closer look. Story 9. The house lights that weren't there in daylight driving a lonely stretch of mountain road near dusk in North Carolina. Melinda noticed a small farmhouse set back from the road, warm light glowing from its windows, smoke rising gently from the chimney. A scene of ordinary domestic comfort in an otherwise empty stretch of hills. She passed that same stretch during daylight hours the following week and found nothing there at all. No house, no foundation, no clearing large enough to have ever held a structure. Just dense, undisturbed forest running unbroken along the roadside. She asked a long-time local about it, describing the house in detail, and was told that a farmhouse matching that exact description had burned down on that property decades earlier. The family inside lost entirely, and that a handful of evening travellers over the years had described seeing it exactly as Melinda had. Lit and warm, always at dusk, always gone by the light of day. Story 10. A stone circle that moved deep in a remote section of the Appalachians in Virginia, a small circle of standing stones, unremarkable and largely unknown outside a handful of local hikers, had long been rumoured to shift position slightly between visits, stones a few feet from where they'd been remembered, an arrangement subtly different from photographs taken on prior trips. Skeptical hikers who set out specifically to document the phenomenon, marking stone positions carefully with GPS coordinates and stakes, returned weeks later to find the stakes still in place, but the stones themselves shifted just outside the margin any natural process like frost heave could explain. No official archaeological survey has ever fully explained the stones' origin or their apparent movement, and the local hiking community has largely settled into a quiet agreement to document the site respectfully, without disturbing it further, treating its strangeness as simply one more unexplained feature of a range that seems to hold more of them than most. Story 11. The footsteps that matched his own hiking alone on a remote trail in the Blue Ridge Range. Tobias became aware, gradually, of a second set of footsteps falling in perfect rhythm behind his own, matching his pace exactly no matter how he varied his speed, stopping the instant he stopped, resuming the instant he did. He turned repeatedly to check the trail behind him, finding it empty every time, the footsteps resuming again the moment he faced forward and continued walking. He hiked out faster than he'd planned, the footsteps never faltering, never closing the distance, simply present behind him the entire way until he reached the trailhead and the sound of other hikers' voices, at which point the footsteps stopped entirely and did not return. He has hiked that trail since without incident, but he has never again gone alone, unwilling to test whether the footsteps return to a hiker walking by himself. Story 12. The church bell with no church residents of a small hollow community in eastern Tennessee have long reported hearing a church bell tolling on certain still evenings, clear and resonant, despite no church having stood in that hollow for over 80 years, the original structure having burned in a fire that claimed the building entirely, bell included, according to town records. Longtime resident Ada Fletcher, now in her 90s, recalls her own grandmother describing the same bell decades before Ada herself began hearing it. Always at dusk, always on unusually still evenings, and always fading into ordinary silence within a few minutes. No source has ever been located for the sound. The Hollow community has, over generations, simply folded it into their understanding of the place, treating it neither as a threat nor as a mystery requiring resolution, but as a quiet, familiar presence marking the hour the way any ordinary bell once did. EO5 MD Chapter 5, the map Corinne's map Jonah came to understand over the following days, was less a single document than the accumulated labour of a decade and a half. Layered like sediment, early pins placed with a novice's imprecision, later ones cross-referenced against county records, weather data, dispatch logs quietly leaked by sympathetic contacts, and a dozen other sources she'd built relationships with over years of patient, unpaid work that had cost her, she admitted one evening over a third pot of coffee. Most of the relationships and financial stability a person her age might otherwise have expected to have. "I had a fiancé once," she said, not quite looking at Jonah as she said it, her eyes on the map instead. "Good man, patient, for a long while. But there's only so many years a person can watch you spend every free hour and most of your money chasing something you can't ever fully prove, something that costs you sleep and friendships and, eventually, him too, before patience runs out." He didn't leave angry, just tired. Said he couldn't keep loving someone who loved a filing cabinet full of ghost stories more than she loved him. She shrugged, a small, old gesture worn smooth by repetition. "He wasn't wrong. Exactly. I just didn't feel like I had a choice. Once you've seen what I've seen, once you know what I know happened to my father, it stops feeling like an obsession and starts feeling like the only responsible thing left to do." It was the first time she'd mentioned her father directly, and Jonah heard the door open in her voice the way he recognised. Now, the same door had opened in his own when he'd finally told her about Dale's boots, 2 nights before, both of them sitting up long past midnight in the garage with the coffee gone cold and the wall of red pins watching over them like a congregation of small silent witnesses. "You'll tell me when you're ready," he said, and meant it, and something in Corinne's shoulders eased slightly at not being pushed. "Soon," she said, "not tonight. Tonight I want to show you the actual shape of this, the thing I've never shown anybody who wasn't already 3/4 convinced. Because it takes a certain kind of belief just to look at it and see what it's actually saying." What she showed him was a secondary map, a transparency laid over the primary wall display, showing not the modern interstate system but a patchwork of older routes, wagon trails, rail survey lines, territorial roads predating statehood in half the western states the overlay covered, drawn from historical society archives and university geography departments, and, in a few cases, she admitted, from her own careful digitization of maps so old and fragile that the archivists who'd let her photograph them had made her wear gloves. Laid over the modern interstate system, the correlation was unmistakable. The thickest clusters of red pins fell, again and again, along corridors where the old paths and the new highways ran close together, sometimes directly atop one another, sometimes diverging for a stretch before rejoining a few miles on, and everywhere the two maps diverged significantly, the pin density thinned, sometimes to nothing at all. I-70 through Kansas, Corinne said, tracing a long flat stretch that showed almost no pins despite running through country every bit as lonely, statistically, as the corridors that showed clusters. You'd think, if this were just about isolation, this'd be one of the worst stretches in the country. Flat, empty, long distances between services. But there's almost nothing here. Because this exact routing is modern, built for the interstate system in the 50s and 60s, doesn't follow any older path, doesn't sit on top of anything with a longer history. Compare that to this. Her finger moved south and west to the corridor running roughly along old Route 66, the cluster so dense in places that individual pins overlapped into a solid red mass, which has been a travel route, in one form or another, for far longer than there's been a United States to build a highway system in the first place. So, it's not the road. It's what the road's built on. That's my working theory, for what it's worth, which admittedly isn't much outside this garage. Corinne stepped back from the map, studying the whole sprawling composite with the particular exhausted satisfaction of someone looking at a life's work that had never once earned her a dime or a shred of public credibility. I think, whatever this is, it's ancient enough that it predates the concept of a highway entirely. I think it's tied to specific corridors of land, not to asphalt, and I think it's adapted. The way a river doesn't disappear just because you build a dam, it just finds a new channel. To every new form of travel humans have layered on top of those same corridors, generation after generation. Trail, wagon road, rail line, highway, interstate. Different vehicles, different speeds. Same underlying geography. Same underlying pattern of who gets taken and why. She pulled up a final overlay. This one thinner, more speculative, dotted with question marks in places rather than solid red pins. This is as far back as I've been able to trace it, working with a couple of anthropology contacts who've been generous enough not to laugh me out of the room. There's a pattern in some of the oral histories collected from communities along these same corridors going back well over a century, of a specific kind of caution around travel after dark, warnings, specific to certain stretches of land, about not travelling those routes alone, about the danger increasing for travellers who'd become separated from their group, who had nobody with them who'd raise an alarm if they didn't arrive. I'm not going to pretend I understand the full history there, or that it's my place to fully explain traditions that don't belong to me. But the through line is unmistakable once you've spent as many years staring at this map as I have. Whatever this is, it's old, it's patient, and it has never, as far as I can tell, needed to change its fundamental method, only its costume. Jonah stood in front of the map for a long time, taking in the full, sprawling scope of it, decades of red pins, generations of quiet disappearances filed away as coincidence or misfortune or simple bad luck, a pattern hiding in plain sight because no single sheriff's department, no single state, no single agency had ever had the reach or the inclination to connect one lonely vanishing 400 miles from the next, and felt the specific vertigo of a man realizing that a private, personal grief was in fact one small thread in an enormous tapestry that had been weaving itself invisibly for longer than anyone alive could fully account for. How many, he said finally, total, however far back you can trace it. Corinne was quiet for a moment, and when she answered her voice had gone very careful, very level, the voice of someone reciting a number she'd worked hard not to let become just a number. Confirmed, documented, cross-referenced enough that I'd stake my reputation on the pattern being real and not coincidence. 312. Going back to the earliest reliable interstate era records I could dig up, so call it 70 years. She paused. Probable, based on the older overlay, the oral histories, the pattern extending backward before reliable record keeping. I honestly don't know. Could be 1,000. Could be more. I try not to think about the full number too often, because it stops feeling like research and starts feeling like something closer to grief for people I never met, spread out over more than a century, and there's only so much of that a person can carry before it breaks something in them. Dutch survived it, Jonah said. You said it yourself. Everyone who talked their way past a sighting survived. That means it's not inevitable. That means there's a way through. There's a way through for some encounters, Corinne said carefully, I want to be honest with you about the limits of what I actually know, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve false comfort. Dutch survived a hitchhiker encounter, alone, on a road, with time to think and talk his way clear before things escalated. Your Barstow sighting was different, a duplicate rig, your brother's specific truck, holding position rather than approaching directly. I don't have a clean pattern for what that kind of sighting means, because in every case I've documented where a witness reported a duplicate vehicle instead of a hitchhiker, the witness, she stopped, and Jonah watched her decide, visibly, whether to finish the sentence. Say it. The witness didn't survive to be interviewed a second time, Corinne said quietly. I only have their sighting because somebody else was in the truck with them, or because it showed up on a dash cam that got recovered afterward. You're the first person I've ever spoken to directly who reported a duplicate vehicle sighting and lived long enough afterward to describe it to me in your own words instead of a second-hand account pieced together after the fact. The garage went very quiet, the hum of the monitors and the tick of the old wall clock the only sound, and Jonah stood in front of the map. 312 confirmed, maybe 1,000 more lost to history, his brother's boots tied in a double knot in an evidence box in Winnemucca. A green Peterbilt holding position off his shoulder for 40 terrible minutes outside Barstow, and understood, fully, for the first time, exactly how much was actually at stake in the choice he'd already made to keep driving toward an answer instead of away from it. Then, we'd better figure out what makes a duplicate vehicle sighting different, he said, before it decides to finish whatever it started outside Barstow. Corinne looked at him for a long moment, something like fear and something like relief moving together across her face, and then she turned back to the map, to the dense red cluster running along the old road toward Nevada, and put her finger on a stretch of highway neither of them had discussed yet. A place the map called, in her own small, careful handwriting, simply Widow's Mile. Then we go there next, she said, because if there's an answer to that question anywhere on this map, that's where 30 years of witnesses have told me to look for it.
There is a second hayfield that has been the subject of similar long-range careful observation in the families of a different watershed, in a different hollow, on the north side of the Upper Elk, where a family named Yoakum has, by the careful long-range account of the older people of that watershed, been keeping an old hayfield in a similar restricted mowing pattern for 4 generations. The hayfield in question is a slightly smaller field than the reedy hayfield on the Upper Cumberlands, and it is, by the careful long-range observation of the Yoakum family, of a similar kind. The perimeter rule is the same. The time of day rule is the same. The chain of family transmission of the rule is the same. The Yoakum hayfield is, by the careful long-range account of the family, on a piece of ground that was, in the 1800s, on the lower edge of a Cherokee campsite. The Cherokee campsite in question has been carefully documented by the local historical society, and the documentation is on the public record. The Cherokee campsite was, by the documentation, in use from at least the early 1700s until the removal of the Cherokee from that part of the Elk in the 1830s. The Yoakum family has, by the family's long-range oral record, kept the hayfield under the same restriction for as long as the Yoakum family has been on the hayfield, which is, by the long, careful record, since the 1860s. The restriction has, by the long, careful record, been communicated in every generation, by the older members of the Yoakum family, to the younger members, in the careful, long, slow, unadorned language of mountain parents who are explaining a thing to children who have not yet understood the thing, but who are going to understand it in due course, by the long, patient attention of the family. The restriction, by the long, careful record, is the same restriction that has been communicated in the families of the Reedy Hayfield on the Cumberlands. And it has, by the long careful record, been in force for as long as either family can remember. The voices in the Yoakum Hayfield are, by the careful long-range account of the Yoakum family, slightly different from the voices in the Reedy Hayfield. The voices in the Yoakum Hayfield are, by the careful long-range account of the family, lower in pitch than the voices in the Reedy Hayfield. The voices in the Yoakum Hayfield are, by the family's careful long-range account, more song-like, in the patient long slow way that older Appalachian song-like things are song-like. The voices in the Yoakum Hayfield are, by the family's careful long-range account, more patient, in the patient long slow way that older Appalachian voices are patient. The voices in the Yoakum Hayfield do not, by the family's careful account, carry any words that the Yoakum family has been able to translate. The Yoakum family has, in the long-range careful record, been keeping its own mowing pattern and its own observation of the perimeter. The Yoakum family has, in the long-range careful record, been approaching the perimeter fence line in the same careful restrained way that the Reedy family has been approaching the perimeter fence line of its field. And the Yoakum family has, by the long-range careful record, been observing the same phenomenon that the Reedy family has been observing in its field, with the same long-range careful attention, and with the same long-range careful restraint in communicating the observation to anyone outside the immediate kinship. The Yoakum family has, on at least 3 occasions that the careful long-range record preserves, had a member of the family hear the voices in the hayfield. The Yoakum family has, in each of those instances, recorded the time of day, the weather, the season, the kind of day, the phase of the moon, the location of the hearer along the perimeter, and the subjective description of what the hearer perceived. The records of the Yoakum family have not, by the family's deliberate choice, been made available to anyone outside the immediate family, and the family has, by that same deliberate choice, declined to discuss the records with outsiders. What the Yoakum family has said, in the occasional conversation with outsiders, is that the hayfield is, in the family's long-range observation, a place that has, by long custom, been doing what the Reedy Hayfield has been doing on the Cumberlands, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been patient, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been gentle, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been the long, slow, patient work of the place itself. The family has said, in those occasional conversations, that the work of the place has not, in the family's careful observation, ever caused any of the family to be frightened. The work of the place, the family has said, has been the long, patient, slow, long, slow. And this, again, is doing considerable work in the family's description, work of the place itself, and the family, in the long, patient practice of being on the place, has been keeping the place in the long-range careful way that families in those hills have been keeping their places for as long as families have been in those hills. _ extra 15 _ There is another granny woman story, told in a slightly different form, on a different creek, in McDowell County, West Virginia. The creek in question is the head of the North Fork of the Elkhorn, near a place called Maybury. The granny woman in this story was a woman named Dovie Mullins, who lived in the 1800s and who was, by the long careful oral record of the families of the Upper Elkhorn, the most powerful granny woman in the entire watershed for at least 2 generations. Dovie was, by the careful long-range record of the families who remember her, a thin, sharp woman with a long, calm face and a habit of speaking very softly. Dovie was, by the long, careful record of the families, a woman of considerable spiritual authority. Dovie was, by the long, careful record of the families, a granny who was not, in the ordinary careful practice of the granny women of those counties, given to dramatic claims. Dovey was, by the long, careful record of the families, a granny who was known for two things. The first thing Dovey was known for was the herb work. The second thing Dovey was known for was the intercession with the long, patient things of the Upper Elkhorn. There is a story, told with great care in the families of the Upper Elkhorn, about a particular night in the spring of 1897, when Dovey was called to a berth at a cabin on the Upper Elkhorn that had been going badly for more than a day. The laboring woman in this case was a young woman of 20, the daughter of a family who had, by long custom, lived on the Upper Elkhorn. The labor had begun, by the family careful record, on a Monday evening in early May. The labor had not, by Wednesday morning, resolved. The family had called Dovey, by the ordinary careful practice of those families, on the Tuesday evening. When the labor had begun to take on the long, slow, patient shape that older mountain midwives recognize as the shape of a labor that is not going to resolve, Dovey had come. Dovey had, in the patient, long, slow, careful way of the old granny women, gone about the ordinary work of the difficult labor. Dovey had, by her own careful later account, walked out to the spring at the head of the Elkhorn, at the back of the cabin, very late on Tuesday night, with the candle still lit inside. Dovey had, by her own careful later account, brought back a measure of water in a small jar. Dovey had, by her own careful later account, given the water at the moment of crisis on Wednesday morning. And what happened, by the long careful record of the family, was the same thing that happens, by the long careful record of the Sugar Creek granny women, in their own long-range careful practice. The laboring woman, by the family's careful record, felt, at the moment the water was given, that she was no longer alone at the bedside. The laboring woman, by her own careful later account, was joined, at the moment the water was given, by a presence that was not Dovey and was not any of the other women in the cabin. The presence stood, by the laboring woman's careful later account, at the foot of the bed in the long, slow, patient way that the presence at the foot of the bed stands, by the long-range careful record of the granny women of those hills. The presence did not speak. The presence did not, by any careful observation of any of the women in the cabin, do anything that could be photographed or recorded. The presence did, by the careful long-range observation of the laboring woman and of Dovey and of the other women in the cabin, take hold of the labor. The labor, by the careful long-range record of the family, resolved within the hour. The child was born alive. The labor, in the careful long-range observation of the family, had been attended, in the same long, slow, patient way that the labors of the Sugar Creek granny women are attended. What the laboring woman said, in her own long-range careful account, was that the presence at the foot of the bed had, by her careful observation, been waiting. She said, in the careful, quiet, easy voice that the older women of the Upper Elkhorn use for these things, that the presence had, by her careful observation, not come when the labor began, had not come during the long, slow, difficult Tuesday night, and had not, by her careful observation, been in the cabin during the long, slow, difficult Wednesday morning. The presence, by the laboring woman's careful long-range observation, had arrived at the moment the water was given, and the presence, by the laboring woman's careful long-range observation, had been there, in the cabin, at the end of the bed, waiting for the water to be given, since sometime on the Tuesday before. This is, in the mountain oral tradition of those counties, the careful, long, slow pattern that has emerged over many generations of patience and many careful long-range observations by the granny women of the upper watersheds of those hills, as the patient long, slow pattern by which the long, patient things of those watersheds have been attending to the difficult labors of the families. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is, in the long-range, careful, patient observation of the granny women of those hills, what the long, patient and, Again, the word long is doing serious long-range work here. Things of those watersheds do. And the doing of it is, in the long-range careful patient observation of the granny women of those hills, what those long patient things have been doing in those hollers. For as long as the families of those hollers have been attending to the long patient attendance of those long patient things. Underscore. Extra underscore 16 underscore. There was, in the years after the death of the son of Claiborne Hall, a third phase of the life of the cabin at the end of Sawmill Hollow. And the third phase is, in the careful long-range record of the family, the most mysterious of the three. The third phase began when the grandson, who was then in his 40s, took the cabin in the ordinary long, slow way that cabins in those hollers are taken after the death of his father. The grandson moved in with his wife, a woman named Lorna, and his 2 children, girls of 9 and 12. He did not, in the ordinary careful long-range way of the men of those hollers, live in the cabin in any kind of full-time occupation. He lived in the cabin intermittently, on weekends, in the summer, in the long, slow, careful way that grandchildren of mountain families who have moved to the city return to the cabin, to tend to the small, ordinary business of the cabin, to mow the yard, to keep the porch intact, to watch the place when the older generations have died. What Lorna noticed, on the first weekend after the family moved in, was the same thing that the son had noticed in the years before the son's death. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the small, private sounds of a kitchen, late at night, when no one was in the kitchen. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the sounds of footsteps on the porch, when no one was on the porch. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the sounds of someone walking, with the patient, attentive weight of a person, to the edge of the floorboard near the door of the smaller bedroom, and stopping, and standing, and being, very quietly, patient. Lorna was, by her own careful account, raised in a city. She was, by her own careful account, not given to the older practices of the hollers of the Upper Pound. She was, by her own careful later account, frightened, at first, in the way that city people are frightened by the long, slow, patient old sounds of a mountain cabin, late at night. She went to her husband. She spoke to him about the sounds. He was, she said, by her own careful later account, unsurprised. He was, by her own careful account, entirely comfortable with the sounds. He was, by his own careful later account, accustomed to the sounds. He told her, in the careful, unadorned language of an older mountain man speaking to a city wife, about the long, slow, patient sounds of an old family cabin, that the cabin had been doing this since the time of his grandfather. He told her that the doing of this was, in his long-range experience, something that the cabin did. He told her, in the same careful, unadorned language, that he and the cabin had, by long practice, made the arrangement by which the long, slow, patient sounds could be what the long, slow, patient sounds were, and the family could be what the family was, in the patient, long, slow way that the long, patient things of the Central Appalachians have long, slow, patient arrangements with the families that have lived among them. Lorna, by her own careful later account, sat with the sounds for that first weekend, and then for the next several weekends, and then for the next several summers. She sat with the sounds in the long, slow, unadorned way of a woman who has, by long practice in a city, become accustomed to the long, slow, patient sounds of an old family cabin late at night. She sat with the sounds in the careful, long, slow, unadorned way of the older women of those hollers who have, by long practice, learned to keep the long, slow, patient sounds of those cabins in their long, slow, patient, and unadorned place. What Lorna said on the Sunday evening before they left the cabin at the end of that first summer was this. She said, on the porch, in the careful, easy, unadorned voice that the city wife had, by the long practice of the summer, learned to use for the long, slow, patient things of the cabin that she had felt, by long, careful observation of the weekend and the summer, and the long, slow evenings in the cabin that the cabin had been, and the long, slow, patient way that the cabin had, being shared. She said that the sharing had, by her careful long-range observation, not been hostile. She said that the sharing had, by her careful long-range observation, been gentle, in the long, slow, patient way that the long, patient things of those hollers are gentle. She said that the sharing had been, in her careful long-range observation, the long, slow, patient way of an old family cabin welcoming a city wife who was, by the long, slow, patient, quiet practice of the summer, becoming, in her own long, slow, patient way, an old family wife. She said, in the same careful, long, slow, easy voice, that she would, in the long run, become one of the women of the holler, and that the becoming of it had, by her patient, careful observation, been the long, slow, patient, quiet work of the cabin itself. And that the cabin, in the long, slow, patient way that the cabin had been doing its work. __extra C17 __. There was a second event on Elk Ridge, by the careful long-range record of the Reedy family, in the spring of 1983, in the same cabin, with the same family members present, and with the same phenomenon. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the family, more emphatic than the first. The second event was, in the careful long-range observation of the family, brief. The second event was, in the family's careful long-range observation, preceded by the same atmospheric conditions as the first event, a still night, with high pressure, with the kind of late spring, soft, steady, clear weather that the families of the Upper Elk associate with the long, slow, patient activity of the long, patient things of the ridges. The second event occurred on a Friday evening in early May. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, gathered for the spring planting. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, gone to bed in the ordinary long, slow, patient way of a mountain family of the Upper Elk. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, been woken, in the deep hours of the night, by a sound that was not the sound of the cabin settling, and that was not, by any careful long-range observation of any of the family members who were woken, the sound of any ordinary small event in the long, patient, ordinary nighttime activity of the cabin. The sound was, by the careful long-range record of the eldest daughter of the cousin who was in the small front bedroom on the second night of the event 5 years before, the sound of a child speaking. The child was speaking in a voice that was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably the voice of a child. The voice was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably female. The voice was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably young, not 5 or 6, not 9 or 10, but, she said later, with the careful long-range observational patience that the eldest daughter of the family had developed over the long, slow practice of listening to the long, patient things of the cabin, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, speaking in the patient, small voice of a child that young. The child said, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, what sounded like a word, in a voice that was unmistakably the voice of a child trying, with the patient small effort of a very young child, to say something. The word was not, by her careful long-range observation, a word that any member of her family or any member of the extended family had, in any careful listening, been able to identify. The eldest daughter got up. She walked through the bedroom. She went to the landing at the top of the stairs. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was coming from the attic. She went up the ladder to the attic. The attic was empty. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was not coming from the attic. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was coming in the patient small voice of a child, from somewhere under the floor of the second story, in the patient small place between the joists and the boards of the original floor. She did not, by her careful long-range account, go down into the place between the joists and the boards. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to find the source of the voice. She went back to her bedroom. She closed the door. She sat in the dark for some time. She did not, in the long-range, careful, patient observation that she had learned from the family, attempt to respond to the small voice in the floor. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to call out. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to investigate. She let the small voice be the small voice. She let the small voice, by the patient long slow practice of the family, do its small long slow work. In the patient small long slow way, let small voices do their small long slow work in the patient small long slow places of old mountain cabins on the long patient ridges of the central Appalachians. The voice, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, did not repeat. The voice was, by her careful long-range observation, a single small patient utterance, and the utterance was, by her careful long-range observation, the kind of utterance that patients, in the patient long slow way of mountain patients, make when they have, by long small patient work, finally said what they have, by long small patient work, been waiting to say. The utterance was, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, the utterance of a small patient who had by long small patient work finally gotten to say something. In the long patient work of the long patient work of being, by long patient work, present in the long patient place, underscore extra underscore C18 underscore. There was a second event in the cemetery at the Upper Watauga in 2014, in the late spring, with a different phenomenon, with the same careful light, and with the same committee observations. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the committee, different in shape from the earlier events. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the committee, the event that the committee has, in the careful, quiet, easy, unadorned, long, slow language of the older members of the committee, called the Night of the Lights, and it has, by the careful long-range record of the committee, become the most carefully remembered of the events of the Upper Watauga Cemetery in the long, slow history of the committee that has been keeping the cemetery in the dark. The Night of the Lights occurred on a Wednesday in early May. The committee had, by the careful long-range record of the committee, gone up to the cemetery in the early evening, in the patient ordinary long slow way that the committee has been going up to the cemetery in the evening for as long as the committee has been keeping the cemetery in the dark. The committee had, by the careful long-range record of the committee, begun the mowing in the ordinary long slow patient way. The mowers were running. The floodlights were on. The committee was, in the ordinary long slow patient unadorned way, working the perimeter of the cemetery, with the small noises of the mowers in the air, with the smell of the cut grass, with the dark of the Upper Watauga beginning to rise in the meadow behind the cemetery. The first light appeared at about 9 o'clock. The light was, by the careful long-range observation of one of the committee members who was working the eastern section of the cemetery on that Wednesday evening, not a normal light. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, of the kind of color that a candle produces when the candle has been burning steadily for an hour in a still room, with no draft. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, approximately the warmth of a candle. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, very small. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, moving in a slow patient procession along the row of headstones in the eastern section of the cemetery. The light, by his careful long-range observation, was pausing briefly at each headstone. The committee member who was working in the eastern section did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to approach the light. He did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to speak to the light. He did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to interrupt his mowing. He let the mowing be the mowing. He let the light be the light. He finished the strip he was working. He moved to the next strip. He did not, on any of the subsequent strips, look up at the light. The committee member who was working in the western section saw the second light. The second light was, by her careful long-range observation, of the same warm amber color as the first, and of the same small size, and of the same slow, patient procession. The second light, by her careful long-range observation, was moving along the row of headstones in the western section of the cemetery, in the patient, slow, deliberate way of the first light. And the third light appeared in the center of the cemetery, by the careful long-range observation of the committee member who was working the southern section. The third light was, by the careful long-range observation of the committee member, in the patient, small, warm amber color of the first two. The third light was, by her careful long-range observation, not moving. The third light was, by her careful long-range observation, simply present, in the patient, still way that the patient presence of the cemetery, by the long, slow, patient, unadorned observation of the committee, sometimes is. The third light, by her careful long-range observation, was, very simply, present. The committee continued the mowing in the patient, ordinary, slow, unadorned way of the committee. The mowers ran. The lights persisted, in their patient way, for what the committee's careful long-range observation estimated, retrospectively, as approximately 4 to 5 minutes. The committee, by its long, slow, ordinary, careful, patient practice, finished the perimeter of the cemetery. The committee, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful practice, finished the next pass inward. The committee, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful practice, finished the evening's work. The lights, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful observation of the committee, persisted for the duration of the work. The lights, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful observation of the committee, disappeared in the quiet, easy, ordinary, long, slow, careful way when the committee put the mowers away. And the committee walked in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of the committee down the lane to the parking area, and the committee sat in the patient, ordinary way in the trucks in the parking area, and the committee did not, by the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned practice of the committee, discuss the events of the evening at any great length. The committee, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned way, scheduled the next mowing for Friday evening. The committee went home. The cemetery, by the careful long-range observation of the committee, settled back into its ordinary quiet. The lights, by the careful long-range observation of the committee, did not return. What the committee said in the days that followed, in the patient, ordinary way, has been preserved in the careful long-range record of the cemetery committee, with the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful precision of the committee. The committee said, in the patient, ordinary way, that the cemetery had been doing what the cemetery, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful practice, did on quiet nights in late spring. The committee said that the cemetery was, in the patient, ordinary way, attending to itself. The committee said that the attending to itself had, in the patient, ordinary way, taken the form, on that Wednesday in late spring, of 3 small amber lights, and that the 3 small amber lights had, in the patient, ordinary way, done what the 3 small amber lights are understood to do. In the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful practice of the older families of the Upper Watauga, on the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful nights when the older families of the Upper Watauga are keeping, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way that the older families of the Upper Watauga have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful custom, been keeping the cemetery in the dark. Extra C19 . There is one final thing that Theo's daughter, who is still alive, who has been since her father's death in 1991, the keeper of the story, asked me to add to the account of her father's return. The thing she asked me to add is not, in her careful and deliberate judgment, the most dramatic part of the story. The thing she asked me to add is, in her careful and deliberate judgment, the part of the story that has, in the 33 years since her father's death, done the longest, slowest work in her memory. The thing she asked me to add is the part of the story that has, in her own careful, reflective, long-range judgment, become the part of the story she tells most often, and the part of the story that is, in her own careful, long-range judgment, the most likely to be true. The thing she asked me to add is the matter of the dogs. The family had, on the property at the Big Creek, 2 dogs. The 2 dogs were a coonhound and a small terrier. The 2 dogs had, by the long, careful, patient, ordinary observation of the family, been ordinary dogs for the entirety of their lives up until the Tuesday in February, when Theo had come back from the woods. The 2 dogs had, in the long, careful, patient, ordinary observation of the family, begun, in the weeks after Theo's return, to behave in a way that the family had never before observed in any dog. The dogs, by the careful, long-range observation of Theo's daughter, who was then in her late 20s, and was, by her own careful account, paying very close attention to the dogs, began to follow Theo. They began, very simply, to follow him with the patient, careful, long, slow, ordinary attentiveness of 2 dogs who had, by some long, slow, ordinary process in the weeks after Theo's return, decided that Theo was the thing in the household to which they should attend. They followed him from room to room. They followed him from the front porch to the back porch. They followed him to the woodpile and to the spring and to the barn. They followed him in the long, slow, patient, ordinary way. In the long, slow, patient, ordinary way. In the patient, long, slow, ordinary way of dogs who have decided that the person they are following is, for some reason, the dogs themselves understand and the family does not fully understand, the person to whom they should, by long, slow, patient, ordinary dog attention, attend. The dogs did not, by Theo's daughter's careful, long-range observation, bark at him. The dogs did not, by her careful, long-range observation, greet him in the ordinary, long, slow, patient way that dogs greet people. The dogs did not, by her careful, long-range observation, wag the dogs. By her careful, long-range observation, attended to him in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive way that dogs attend to something that is not, in some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way, strictly a person. The dogs attended to Theo in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of dogs who have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation, detected, in the person they are following, something that the dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been taught to attend to, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that old mountain dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been taught to attend to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that the dogs themselves, by some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog perception, are able to detect. The dogs followed Theo for the entirety of the 9 years after his return. The dogs followed him with the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive focus of 2 dogs that have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, made a long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful commitment to a person and to the presence they have detected in the person. The dogs followed him into his bed at night. The dogs followed him into his long, patient evening hours on the porch. The dogs followed him into his long, patient, ordinary, careful death in the spring of 1991. The dogs, by Theo's daughter's careful, long-range observation of the days and weeks and months after Theo's death, did not, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way, leave the house. The dogs, by her careful, long-range observation, remained in the house. The dogs, by her careful, long-range observation, took up, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way of two dogs that have decided to attend to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that had been with the person they had been following, attending to that presence itself, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that the old mountain dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been attending to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presences that have been in those hollers, attending to the families that have lived in those hollers. The dogs lived for several years after Theo's death. The dogs lived in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way in the cabin at the Big Creek, attending to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that had, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that the long, patient things of those hollers do their long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful work, remained after Theo's death in the cabin. The dogs attended to the presence with the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive focus of two dogs that have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, made the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful commitment of attending, for as long as the dogs are alive, to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence itself. Theo's daughter has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language of a woman who has been the keeper of a story for 33 years, and who has, by long, patient, ordinary, careful practice, considered every aspect of the story with the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful attention that the long, patient things of those hollers deserve, that the dogs are the part of the story she is most willing to vouch for. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language of an older mountain woman telling me about the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful thing her father had, by his long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful absence in the woods, brought back with him, that the dogs could tell. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language that the keeper of the family story uses for the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful things of the Big Creek, that the dogs attended to the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful presence that had come back with her father, and that the dogs attended to it in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of old mountain dogs for as long as the dogs were alive. She has said, in the last minutes of every interview I have done with her over the 33 years that I have been asking her about her father, that she believes, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation of the dogs, that the presence that came back with her father is real. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language, that she does not know what the presence is. She has said that the presence is not, in her long, patient, ordinary, careful judgment, hostile. She has said that the presence is, in her long, patient, ordinary, careful judgment, what the woods, by long, patient, ordinary, careful custom, do for the families who have, by long, patient, ordinary, careful practice, earned the long, patient, ordinary, careful. And the word long here is doing serious, patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful work. Company of the long, patient, ordinary, careful presence of the long, patient, ordinary, careful, patient presence of the woods. _extra C20 _. There is another sighting by Coy. It is the second of the sightings that Coy told me about, in the kitchen of the cabin on the Upper Clinch, on the winter afternoon when the dark was coming up off the river. The second sighting occurred 23 years after the first sighting, in 1999, in the autumn, in the same Upper Clinch watershed where the first sighting had occurred, and on a ridge that is, by the careful long-range observation of Coy, in the same general vicinity of the first sighting. Coy was, at the time of the second sighting, 51 years old. He was, by his own careful account, not at that point in his career working in the deep woods in the way he had been working in the first sighting. He was, by his own careful long-range account, working, by then, as a contractor in a small operation that did selective logging and that ran, by Coy's careful long-range account, in the Upper Clinch watershed, in the part of the Upper Clinch watershed where the first sighting had occurred. He was, on the morning of the second sighting, walking a tract that had been logged in the previous winter, looking for a stand of mature poplar that his buyer had asked him to mark. He was, by his own careful account, alone on the tract. His partner that week was a young man named Eldon, who had been with him for 2 summers and who had, that morning, gone down the ridge to deliver a small load of bolts to the buyer's yard at the lower end of the ridge. Coy was alone in the woods in the morning, in the same way he had been alone in the woods in the morning 23 years before. He was, on the morning of the second sighting, wearing a long dark wool shirt that his wife had, by the careful long-range observation of Coy's wife, packed for him in the ordinary careful way that careful mountain wives pack long-sleeved dark wool shirts for their husbands for cool autumn mornings on the upper ridges. Coy was, at about mid-morning, working his way down a small saddle on the upper west side of the ridge, in a small stand of mature hardwood that had, by the careful long-range observation of Coy, not been logged in the previous winter operation. He was marking trees with a small can of blue paint in the careful ordinary way of selective loggers. He was, by his own careful account, paying attention to the stand of poplar in the ordinary working way of a working selective logger. He said in the kitchen of the cabin that what he saw was the figure. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, in the trees on the far side of the stand watching him. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, in the same patient, unmoving, attentive posture as the figure had been in 23 years before. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, wearing the same long dark shirt. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, in the same pale amber color that the figure had been in 23 years before. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, engaged in the same patient, long, slow, unadorned, ordinary attentive work that the figure, by Coy's careful long-range observation, had been engaged in 23 years before. The figure was, by Coy's careful long-range observation, watching him with the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive focus that the figure, by Coy's careful long-range observation, had been watching him with 23 years before. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to wave. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to speak. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to approach. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to do anything that he would not have done 23 years before, and he would not have done 23 years before anything that would have made him, in any careful long-range observation of the patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive manner of the figure, have done anything to break the patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive observation that the figure, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation of the figure itself, had been doing, for as long as the figure had been doing it. Coy watched the figure, on the morning of the second sighting, for what he estimated as about a minute. Coy did not, by his careful long-range account, look away. Coy did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt, in the careful, unadorned, ordinary, long, slow way of a man who has seen this once before, to do anything other than the watching. Coy watched the figure watching him. Coy watched, in the careful, unadorned, ordinary, long, slow way, The patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive focus of a figure that had, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful attentiveness, decided in some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way to be present in the upper clinch on a cool autumn morning in 1999, in the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive way that the figure had, by the figure's own long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive practice, decided to be present in the upper clinch 23 years before. And the figure, on the morning of the second sighting, took a single step back, in the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive way. And the figure, by Coy's careful, long-range observation, became, by the careful, long, slow, ordinary, patient, attentive process of its own withdrawal, the woods themselves. Coy did not, in the weeks and months and years after the second sighting, attempt to do anything except what Coy has, by his own careful, long-range observation, always done. Coy finished the tract. Coy marked the poplar. Coy went home, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way. Coy ate dinner with his wife and his 2 sons. Coy told his wife about the second sighting, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way he has, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice, of telling his wife about the things that have happened to him on the upper clinch. His wife did not, on the evening of the second sighting, react in any way that would indicate, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice of the household, that the second sighting was unusual. His wife, by Coy's careful, long-range account, had been expecting it. His wife, by Coy's careful, long-range account, had been waiting for Coy to come home and tell her, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way he has, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice, of telling her about the things that have happened to him on the upper clinch, that he had, on the morning of the second sighting, been watched again. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, not gone back to that particular ridge in the years since the second sighting. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, not refused to go back to that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, simply, by ordinary, careful, unadorned, long, slow, working scheduling practice, not had occasion, in the 25 years since the second sighting, to go back to that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, no doubt that the figure is still, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, on that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, no doubt that the figure is, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, doing its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work on that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful, long-range account, no doubt that the figure will, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, go on doing its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work on that particular ridge, for as long as the ridge has been a ridge, and for as long after the ridge is no longer a ridge as the figure itself. By the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, intends to do its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work. Exie, the Granny Woman's Ledger. 3 ridges south of Possum Trot, in a holler so narrow that the sun only reaches the bottom on the longest days of summer, there lived a woman the river folks used to call Aunt Sophronia McElwee. She was, by the time I heard her name spoken aloud, already gone. She had been a granny woman. She had kept a granny book, and the people who went up to her cabin on the winter day she died and broke the lock the family lawyer had put on the door found, beside her, a ledger that nobody in that county, before or since, has been willing to read aloud. And Natchin, what I am about to tell you about that ledger, I learned from her great U-2013 niece, Tess, who is still alive, still lives in a trailer at the mouth of the holler, and who will only talk about it when the lights are off and someone else is in the room. Doc S. Mutation Aunt Sophronia was born in 1890 U 2010-8. She was the seventh of 9 children. Her mother died in childbirth with the 8th, and her father married 12 months later a woman from over on the Cumberland who arrived at the cabin with a leather U 2010 bound book under her arm and a sack of dried roots that smelled, Tess said, of black pepper and turpentine and the iron in creek water. From that woman, Sophronia learned the trade. She learned how to read a pulse by the wrist in 9 seconds. She learned which of the wild U 2010 growing plants on the south slope of the ridge would bring a fever down, and which of them, taken at night, would send a man walking. She learned the words you say in the doorway of a birthing room to keep the wrong spirits out. She learned the words to bring the right ones in when the child is breech and the cord is wrapped. Then, by the time she was 20 U 2010-3, she had taken over her stepmother's book. By the time she was 30, she had added 300 pages of her own. And from then until she was 90 U 2000 tone, she kept adding. Doc NDCN, most of those pages are what you would expect. Names, dates of births, dates of deaths. A remedy for milk fever. A remedy for the sore that came up on the inside of a child's lip when he slept too close to an open chimney. There is, near the back, a section marked with a single folded corner, headed, in a small, even hand, underscore, cases of the other kind, underscore, ND knit, is that last section Tess will not speak of. She will tell you the section exists. She will tell you there are 18 pages. She will tell you that her great U 2013 aunt was a careful woman, and that the entries are not fanciful. There are dates. There are initials. There are places. Sometimes there is weather.name. What Tess will not do is describe what is written on those pages. And I pressed her. I drove up to the holler twice. The second time with a tape recorder she did not know I was running, and she gave me 3 sentences, and then she made a pot of coffee and only spoke to me about her beagle for the rest of the afternoon. The 3 sentences were these. And first, the cases are real, in the sense her great the U 2013 aunt understood real. They are not nightmares. They are not dreams. They are things that walked into the cabin, or onto the porch, or up out of the root cellar, that the granny woman attended to as she would a fever or a difficult birth. Then in second, in every case, the patient was a child under the age of 9. Then in third, in every case but one, the child recovered. Then the one who did not, Tess said, was a boy named Loyal Mullins, age 6, who lived in a cabin at the head of Huckleberry Branch, and who, on the night of October 14th, 1940 U 2010-7, was carried out of his own bed and laid in front of the fire by something that did not enter through the door. GNWN, when Tess said underscore did not enter through the door underscore. She said it the way you say a thing you have been over and over in your own mind until the words have lost their edges. The door was latched. The window was nailed shut with a horseshoe over the nail head. The chimney was too small for anything but a cat to come down. There was snow on the ground, and there were no tracks but the child's. Leading from the bed to the hearth. NN Sophronia was called at 3 in the morning. She walked the 2 miles up the branch in the snow, in her slippers. She was 40 U 2010-9 years old. She carried a leather roll of tools and a small jar of rendered lard into which she had mixed, the week before, ash from a brush pile that had burned on the property for 3 generations. Then what she did in that cabin Tess will not tell me, and what she wrote on page 216 of the ledger she will not read aloud. But she will tell me this. And Sophronia came down the branch before dawn. She was limping. There was blood on the hem of her dress, though she was uncut. The jar of lard was empty. The leather roll was open, and one of the steel tools was missing. And Sophronia, who never in her life, by Tess's recollection, raised her voice in any room, sat down on the porch of her own cabin and wept in the snow until the sun came over the ridge and a neighbor's wife, walking up for chat, found her and led her inside and put a quilt over her shoulders and never, ever asked about it again. 90 Jean Loyal Mullins lived for 9 more days. He did not speak. He did not eat, except for a spoonful of honey a day, drawn from a tin the family kept on a shelf above the stove. He smiled, sometimes, but only when no one was looking. He died with his eyes open. Ng's name on page 216 of the Granny Book. Beneath the entry for October 14th, there is a single line in red ink in Aunt Sophronia's careful hand. NGSen _ do not whistle in that holler. Do not let the children whistle. Do not answer if one of them whistles. _DSHIN NGN people in the holler do not whistle there to this day. Dection. When Tess finally walked me down to her great U 2013 aunt's grave on the south slope of the family cemetery, she stopped at the foot of the headstone and said, very softly, that there are things in the old book that Sophronia only wrote down in the dark. There are names of the dead that do not appear in any church roll. There are descriptions of figures at the tree line of properties where the family has lived for 6 generations. There is, on the last written page of the book, a list of places you are not, by the granny woman's reckoning, ever to spend a night alone. The list has 40 U 2010-2 entries on it. Most of them, I am told, are within a day's drive of where I am sitting now. Snin and I have not read the book. I will not. I do not believe I would survive the reading of it. Nlin, but I have started keeping my own ledger. XI. What the preacher wouldn't forgive. There is a circuit preacher, retired now, who used to hold a week of meetings every August in a brush arbor at the lower end of Tater Holler, and whose sermons, when he reached the part of the revival where the speaking turned to something other than scripture, would cause the metal roof of the arbor to begin, very softly, to ring. I want to be careful here. I am describing a real man in the terms the mountain people use when they talk about him, in the third person, by a name he asked me when I sat with him on his porch one Sunday afternoon in 2010-19, not to use in print. He is in his mid-2010s. He still preaches when somebody can be persuaded to drive him to the pulpit 2 or 3 times a year. He has a grandson he is raising because his daughter, the grandson's mother, Dalu 2014, but I will not go there. He asked me not to. Nenwo, what the preacher told me about August, the brush arbor, and the sound the roof made. He told me only after I had agreed, sitting across a card table from him on his porch, with 2 mason jars of blackberry wine between us, that I would not record the conversation. I did not. I am remembering it now. I am remembering it because 2 nights after we sat together, the preacher's sister called me and told me he had asked me onto that porch because he did not expect to see another August. And he was right. He died that October, on a Tuesday, in his sleep, in a way that, by his own description, written on a folded sheet of paper left for his grandson, was exactly the way he had been told, when he was 17 years old, that he would go. Nacton Duddy and I will tell you what he told me. The brush arbor was set back off the road at the bottom of Tater Holler under 3 oaks that were so old the locals called them the Brothers. It had open sides, a wooden floor, and a corrugated tin roof. There were 13 wooden benches. There was a raised platform for the pulpit. There was a slab of wood behind the pulpit on which the preacher's wife would set her Bible and a tin of water, and a small hand-do 2010 crank fan. And on the second night of revival, when the speaking was in the part of the service where the preacher walked among the benches and laid his hand on the forehead or the shoulder of the person he had been preaching toward, the roof began, very softly, to ring. Neminate was not the rain. Nemet was not an animal on the tin, and nit was, by every person in the arbor's recollection, the sound that a tin roof makes when a person is standing on the other side of it and speaking, very low, very close to the metal, as if listening through it. Ndn now. I want to be plain. The revival people were not frightened. They were, in the language of the circuit, used to such. They were persuaded that what they heard was one of three things. Either it was the Lord speaking, very low, through the holy metal, or it was the lost, somewhere above trying to come down, or it was something else entirely, and they had better not name it, because to name it was to invite it in. Then the preacher told me that he had held this revival for 2010 8 years, that he had felt, on the second night, every year, the roof began to ring, that he had asked his wife, every year, whether she heard it, that she had said, every year that she did. Then he told me that, on the 17th year, he had climbed up onto the roof at the end of the service to see. Then he told me that, on the 17th year, he had found, on the tin, directly above the spot where he had been standing, when he laid his hand on a young man's forehead, and told him, very quietly, that his sins were not the mountain's problem. The problem was only that he had not forgiven himself. 2014 to see Nen. He told me that he had found, on the tin, above that spot, a print, not a hand. Nen a print, in the rust that comes off tin on a dewy night, of a face. Nen a face that was not, in the preacher's careful description, the face of the young man. A face that was not, in his description of it to me, with the jars of blackberry wine between us, the face of any living person he had ever seen. It was, he said, the size of a man's head. It had eyes that were closed. It had a mouth that was open. The jaw was very long. The brow was very low. The features had a patience to them that he did not care to describe in any more detail than that, because he had caught himself, after the third time he had looked at it, breathing in time with it. Then he climbed down. Then he asked his wife to look. Then his wife, who had been his wife for 2010 years at the time, looked at him, and looked at the roof, and told him, very quietly, that she had seen it from the ground, and that she had decided, 20 years before, that what was on the roof was between him and the Lord and not her business, and that she would thank him not to ask her to look at it again. Then, the next morning, the print was gone, and the roof rang on the 18th year, and on the 19th, and on every year after. And the preacher held his revival in the brush arbor at the bottom of Tater Holler, under the 3 oaks that the people there called the Brothers, until the year his voice went out. On the night before he stopped preaching, he told me he had gone up to the roof one more time. Then there was no print that night. Then but there was, on the tin above where his pulpit had stood for 2010 9 Augusts, a single rust 2010 marked line, very straight, very patient, very level, as if drawn with a finger. Then it was the height of a man. Then it ended in a knotted hand. Then he did not go up to the roof again. Then when you ask him, which I only did once, what was on the roof, in the language of the mountains, in the language of the circuit, of the brush arbor, of the meeting, of the long week of August revival under the 3 oaks the locals called the Brothers 2014 Sen Etnet, he will say, very softly, that some things that walk the ridge above a revival are waiting to come down. Then he will say that the Lord, in his mercy, has not opened the door. Nanedinai he will say that he was, for 30 dayu 2010 9 years, the door.ng nain. He will not say what was on the other side. Exii, the last sermon at Piney Fork. Piney Fork is a community the road maps do not show. You turn off the state route on a blacktop that used to be a wagon trace. You pass a 1U 2010 room post office that no longer has hours. You turn onto a dirt road at a place where there is no sign. You go for what feels like a long time. And then the road opens into a clearing at the head of a creek. And in the clearing there is a clapboard church with a steeple the color of rain. Then the church is called, by the people who still drive out to it on the second Sunday of the month, Piney Fork Baptist. It has 30 2,000 tone members. By the count on the board inside the front door, though 4 of those members have been dead for more than 20 years. The pastor, who has held the pulpit since he was 20 2010 3 and who is now 70 2010 9, holds services in the summer on the porch because the inside of the church has, since the winter of 2003, not felt right. Nen and I want to tell you what happened on the Sunday in October, this past year, when the pastor preached his last sermon at Piney Fork. Because I was there. I was the only one not from the church who was there. The wife of the man I was staying with had asked me, on the Friday before, if I would come along. Ned and I did not know, when I said yes, what I was agreeing to. Then there were 19 people on the porch that Sunday. 2 of them were children. One of them was the pastor's granddaughter, who had driven down from the city because she understood. In some way her grandfather had not been willing to say aloud to her that this would be the last service. Then the pastor preached from the book of Job. He preached from the 7th chapter. He preached, in the language of these mountains, slowly and at length, about the months of misery and the nights of pain and the thing that rises before the light of the morning, of which Job says, when I say, my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint, then thou scarest me with dreams, and terrifiest me through visions, Nen, he preached for an hour. He did not, that Sunday, raise his voice. And in the middle of the second hymn, when the people of the congregation had risen and were passing a battered leather Bible from one to the other at the front of the porch, a sound came up out of the ground under the church. Dokchenjinjenitz, it was not a knock, and it was not a creak of the floorboards. And it was, by every ear on that porch, the sound a body makes when it is being turned over in a grave of long standing. And want to be clear that I am not describing a thing that I have gone looking for. I am describing a thing that, on a Sunday in October, came up out of the ground under Piney Fork Baptist Church, while 19 people sang a hymn about walking through the valley. The singing stopped. And then the pastor, who had been standing at the rail of the porch with his Bible in his left hand, set the Bible down. He looked out across the congregation. He did not seem surprised. Has mentioned he had been expecting this. In what he said, in the silence and a voice that did not break, was this. 1U 201C brothers. Sisters, there is a sin of long standing under the floor of this church. There is a wrong that has not been, by any of us, by anyone who has lived in this clearing, made right. The Lord is kind, and he is patient, and he has held his hand.